Yo, 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 what's up, Actuali fam? We are back. It's another episode of Actuali Podcast's special series, Meaning Making 101, during which we cover John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. We have so far covered 42 episodes of this series. It's a 50 lecture long series that John Vervaeke released on YouTube because it was too long to release into any university. 50 lectures making up his theory on how we may help humanity awaken from the meaning crisis we find ourselves in. The meaning crisis being a term that he and others use for the existential crisis our species finds itself in at this moment in history. And that is a crisis of breakdown of our associations with churches, with authority, academia, governmental, whatever it may be. There's been scaling distrust in the prevailing institutions that we used to rally around to find our kind of our moral grounding together. And in that, as a result of that, we see a lot of growing division in our culture and a breakdown of cohesion in our culture. And it amounts to a meaning crisis, which is causing a great deep sense of meaninglessness in people all over the world. The rising depression and anxiety is indicative of that. And so here we are with Professor John Vervaeke, a longtime Buddhist practitioner, Tai Chi master, and teacher, as well as a professor of cognitive science, which is a multidisciplinary field covering many different academic disciplines in the study of human consciousness, from neuroscience to psychology, so on and so forth. So anyway, I'm Chris.
I'm DJ.
And we're very excited to announce that we have new mics now. We're like official podcasters now. We have our new Shure mics plugged in and rocking. We got a new camera, but I still need to get a lens for that camera. So the new camera is probably going to be coming next week, but look forward to improved production value here at Actuali Podcast. We're very excited to be making these moves here and providing you guys with better quality. During this series, it's kind of a watch along. We're basically studying and learning together. We are not any great gurus or educators ourselves. We're just normal guys here trying to get a handle on how we may personally approach the crisis of meaning in our world today. So if you guys are wondering what can we do in these crazy times to help ameliorate the situation even a little bit, you're at the right place. John Vervaeke has been a profound teacher along this path, and we're just going to do a quick recap of our previous episode. I forgot to get us live on Facebook. This is why I can't talk too much in the beginning. This is
Oh
what
no,
happens.
the Facebook is missing out.
Yeah, but for those of you in podcast land, thank you so much for tuning in and staying with us during this marathon of a lecture series. Here we are live on Facebook. What's up, Facebook fam? We are live. And we are back, and I was just talking a little bit about the meaning crisis, as John Vervaeke has described it, the time that we find ourselves in today of increased meaninglessness and growing division. And we're trying to find some hope out here, some actionable hope, see how we can be a part of the change and help change this world. I think the most effective way is going to be from the inside out. We're always hacking at limbs and different kinds of political actions that we make. It's like we're addressing symptoms, but we're not treating the root. And the root is, to any problem in society is within each one of us, because we are what make up society. We groups of individuals. So I'm Chris, this is DJ, and we are back at it. We're going to do a quick recap of the last episode 42 on intelligence, wisdom, and rationality. And then we're going to jump on into this next episode.
So, I guess according to Stanovic, intelligence is not sufficient to like having high intelligence doesn't necessarily make you rational. So, what is it that allows for understanding and rationality? And this idea of active open-mindedness, which should allow you to formulate, and solve problems.
Yes.
Because ultimately we're trying to be problem solvers. Discuss curiosity and wisdom. need for cognition, which is problem finding.
Yes.
Arlen.
Yeah, we learned how problem finders are very good at realizing problems and connecting things that others haven't put together yet. So,
And Arlen stated that wisdom is central to problem finding.
yes.
Right.
Yeah, problem finding is essential to wisdom. And we're looking for a psychotechnology that to help us develop our wisdom. And as Vervaeke describes in this episode, he reminds the term psychotechnology, which we learned in the beginning of the series. A psychotechnology is a socially developed and standardized, systemized methodology that sustains and empowers cognition and can be highly accessible, usable by people. So it's anything that we use in our minds, any kind of set of skills and sensitivities that helps us in a generalized manner to catch our own cognitive biases.
Yeah. So, what makes a good problem solver? And we need to understand that problems are not found within a vacuum. So, a good problem finder finds impactual problems for the existing problems, so within a problem nexus, and then finds the core problem that affects all of the
That's
problems
right.
within that nexus.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the need for cognition, there's one part to it, which is good problem finding, the problem nexus, and then the second part to that is wonder and curiosity. And wonder is a being mode phenomenon, and curiosity is a having mode. When you're, in wonder, you're in the experience. Whereas a curiosity is something that you manipulate through. You're curious, work it through.
You're going and
kinda.
finding the thing. The curiosity is impelling you almost.
So Socrates says wisdom begins in wonder. And so there's two interpretations. There's Plato's interpretation. The point of philosophy is to develop and extend the sense of wonder, deepening it into awe. It gets us involved in this ascending process.
Yes.
It's meta accommodation. It's the quest.
The quest.
And then Aristotle, his interpretation was similar, but basically you shape wonder into curiosity to resolve the wonder.
Mm-hmm.
So it's meta assimilation and the question.
Ah, yes.
And you're stabilizing the wonder. So quest and question, and like it's not a one or the other kind of thing.
They're in an opponent process.
Well, I guess
So it's both happening.
These two interpretations are
Talking about two sides of the same coin.
yeah.
A machine that
The
can operate
wonder
in two ways.
curiosity coin.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like at first you have the wonder, and then you get curious about it, and you start to manipulate. Has such a
To find out.
a bad
Or the other way around. Yeah.
it has such a bad error about it. But manipulate. You manipulate a pen when you write. You manipulate a screwdriver when you use it. You manipulate your car when you drive it. It's not.
It's funny how in our
necessarily an evil
current
thing.
social context, our mind goes to certain
Well,
things.
when you
certain
manipulate
words-
people, that's
Right.
when it starts to get a little.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Stanovic had a positive account of rationality and this dual process. So rationality isn't just one, one factor, one form. It's many different.
In the dual processing theory, there's a lot of convergence in other fields
Yeah.
for this. This goes all the way back to Stoicism and Platonism, but we've also confirmed this in modern age in psychology and therapy.
Yeah. So the two different the two different ways of processing info we call S1 and S2, right? Mm-hmm. So S1 is
The more intuitive,
yeah,
right?
the intuitive, the implicit. It's implicit processing. It's very fast. We use
Very
it to cope.
associative.
Yeah, and it
It's very background. It's very associative, and it's compelled by coping or caring.
yeah. And so then
us,
S2 is a deliberate, both reflective and aware definition of deliberate, inferential,
Yes,
argumentative, not like combative
Emotional.
argumentative, but making an argument,
but theoretically, yeah.
explicit,
And it's slower.
and it's slower. And so
He gave us a good example of the lady at the line. So you get to a line, you're at the grocery store and you get to the checkout counter, and you've got your normal amount of groceries that you buy every 2 weeks, right? And they're like, okay, that's going to be $1,000, and you're immediately like, what? That's S1 process, and it's very quick.
Yeah.
So
And
it's pattern recognition. So you know automatically the approximate idea of how much is in that cart based off of the items you grabbed off the
yeah,
shelves.
it's based off of, well, and also
So you
like,
do a really quick association.
and it's based off of pre-existing heuristics.
So
like,
it's very intuitive. But then the person checking you out's like, no, actually,
yeah.
look on the receipt, and then they go through things one by one by one. Now they're using S2 processing, which is very deliberate. It's slower. It's inferential. It's explicit.
And it's used to override.
It's used to check and
S1
yes.
in a corrective manner too,
Yes.
because
because the S1 can be wrong sometimes.
Yeah.
It's very useful because it's quick, but it's intuitive, and sometimes it's making the wrong inference.
yeah. So
you need the S2 to check
yeah. So
the faster implicit process.
Stanovich has a word for this. It's disrationalia, or you could say foolishness, which
It's like
is
dyslexia, but for the mind, basically.
yeah. And you're highly intelligent, but not training your S2
properly.
Yeah. So you just jump to conclusions, but haven't really trained the ability to take stock of what's actually there and
To check
piece
yourself.
it together.
Yeah.
So what is active open-mindedness doing? And
Well, that's a psychotechnology that we
Yeah.
can use to help counteract this cognitive bias that we tend to have within ourselves, because we don't like to be wrong, and we take anything personally when it feels like we got something wrong. You don't need to, but we do that. And so if we're good at checking ourselves, we can catch when we're starting to take something personally that we don't need to. Like, information's just information. It's good for our opinions to upgrade and change themselves when new data comes along. So we should be open.
yeah, so
being
the
corrected.
S2 is overriding S1, but that's
Yeah, so we can't rely on the S2 for most behavior. It's too slow. But it can override the S1 and that opponent processing relationship, which makes us adaptive. So it does have that corrective function.
well. So
Now, okay, you were talking about the open-mindedness. What does that the A stand for? Active open-mindedness.
open-mindedness.
This is what helps us leap to conclusions, which can be a good thing, not just a bad thing, right?
Yeah, well, it's not just enough to train your S2 to override S1, because we need to be able
I see.
we need to be able to leap to conclusions. And he introduced us to this idea of cognitive leaping.
Yes, that's right.
And you can test how well you do at this by, you basically, have a bunch of dots starting coming up, and eventually you'll be able to see a pattern that they make. In the case that he showed us last time, it was a couch. A bunch of patterns come up, and the quicker you can tell what it's going to be with the less cues to find the pattern, the better you are at leaping.
Yes.
And ideally, we'd want to be good leapers.
Yes.
Because it's a lot quicker than just, always going through the receipts over and over again, which, leads us to what he calls, cognitive suicide. You get entrapped by the, what's it called?
Cognitive explosion.
Combinatorial explosion, which is
Of all the different possibilities and potentials that you could account for at any given time.
Yeah.
You got to be able to narrow down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where the active open-mindedness comes in. It teaches us to protect our processing from being overridden by our capacity for self-deception. So that pattern recognition, using few cues to infer properly and reliably, is really helpful for us to be better at leaping, is to be better at insight. And if we cut off the leaping entirely, we lose our rationality.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the trade-off relationship.
Yeah, so active open-mindedness moderates the relationship between S1 and S2.
It's calibrating.
Yeah, for optimization, not maximization of either or.
So we need good control.
Yeah.
We need to be able to see the rationality beyond theorizing, because it has existential implications.
Yeah, so like in therapy, you don't want to be an S2 mindset, because some things you can't think your way through. You need to be able to express it and get it out to then have an insight about it.
Yeah, we need
So
transformative insights.
you don't get rid of S2, but you background S2
Yes,
and foreground S1.
that's right. Yeah. And those transformative insights, they help us break the frames, the improperly held frames that we may have, to reform them into something more reliable, to optimize our insight and rationality further. So beyond theory, there's therapy. We can't infer or think through our way to solve a problem, like you were just saying. We need to be able to shut down the S2 process and put it in the background and constrain it to foreground the S1.
Yeah.
So mindfulness practices, meditation.
Well, so what mindfulness is a cognitive style, which we've discussed in
Yes.
previous episodes, different styles of cognition, and mindfulness is one of these cognitive
Styles, yes. And meditation is what helps you to develop that cognitive style within yourself. So meditation is an aspect of mindfulness that helps constrain the S2 processing to open us up to S1 processing in a very powerful way, because you can't improve wisdom merely by thinking and intellectualizing. You need to expand the S2 processing, which is very intuitive. The only way to do that, well, you can't exercise that the way you traditionally exercise by like reading
S1.
books or learning languages. You have to do something that allows you to be in the being mode, where you're letting all the information be available at once without choosing anything to focus on, so that you can take in this bigger picture, this gestalt. And that's so meditation is allowing you to be there and be aware of your thoughts as they're going by, and learn to be more mindful.
Yeah, so, your S2 processing is good for planning and for truth, and S1 is good for coping, fitting yourself around things, not necessarily what we think of coping now,
Yes.
but.
So when we need to transform and develop qualitatively, like across a generalized spectrum, we need to use the S1. We need to increase the S1 capacity.
And if,
For S2, that's planning. That's when you're aiming for truth and exactitude.
So Vervaeke has a critique of Stanovich's, we'll say, viewpoint on this. He thinks that Stanovich needs a better account of the trade-off relationship between the two and how to optimize this opponent process that's happening here. So intelligence can enhance relevance realization, and that is called rationality. And you can use rationality to improve rationality as well.
Yes. Yeah. So we can use intelligence to improve how we use our intelligence, and the competencies will optimize, which is what rationality is, using intelligence to prove upon itself. So, and we can also upgrade rationality the same way, which would be crucial to advancing wisdom. And we need the opponent processing practice of mindfulness practices along with active open-mindedness, because the mindfulness is practicing the S1, but we also need practices for our rationality to get the S2 working properly and get them both working in tandem. So a locus for understanding wisdom is for rationality and intelligence to be used in tandem correctly. And I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself there. So rationality is more about the capacity to overcome self-deception and expand sense of meaning in life than intelligence alone tells us. So we have intelligence improving on itself.
Yes.
We've got this ABC grouping here.
Oh yeah. So what that is there's a woman, Karen, and in her book on mindset, she breaks down two different kinds of mindsets. One is a fixed view, and one is a malleable view. And what she did is she created an experiment. Took a bunch of kids, broke them into three groups. So what she did is, with the first group, she went with the trait end, the fixed trait end of praise. Excuse me. The kids were given problems to solve that kids at their level could be able to solve. And then the difference between the three groups is how you praise them for what they did. So you have the trait was, you're so smart. And then the malleable end was, oh, you worked really hard. Because, so this idea of it's fixed from birth, and the errors of that reveal a defect in a non-changeable trait. So it's this permanent thing. So when you have errors, it's well, these errors must be a defect with me. I'm stupid. right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the malleable and the errors point to that there's an issue with the skills or the effort that you put in. So group A, you're praised, you're so smart. This fixed, oh, you're smart. You're as smart as you're ever going to get from birth. The group B kids were told, oh man, you worked really hard. And then the group C kids got a neutral thing. Well, you succeeded on it. Well done.
Yep.
You know, kind of thing. So what ended up happening is the kids who are praised with the fixed, when all the kids were asked who would want to do some slightly harder problems and do it more, those kids didn't want to do it, didn't want to participate. They're like, nah.
The ones that were told that you got this right because you're so
smart.
intelligent.
Yeah,
because
you're smart. It's fixed. And so
we gave them a fixed view of intelligence.
Yeah, so what's going through their heads is like, well, man, like that was already kind of hard, and this is about as smart as I am, so I'm gonna fail if it gets even harder. Whereas the second group of kids that were told, you worked really hard at this, I can tell, you know, you worked real hard. And the third group of kids that got the neutral, both were more open to, let's
particularly that second group that were praised for how hard they worked. So they were praised for the process. So we have two views of intelligence, the fixed view of intelligence and the malleable view. The fixed view turns any errors that we make into this idea of a permanent problem. Whereas the malleable view focuses on the process. There might be a problem in the way that somebody's processing this. It might not be something that is ingrained in their intelligence. They just are processing this incorrectly. So the kids that were praised according to the process of how hard they worked were more likely to be interested in trying even harder problems.
Yeah, and with that also they were asked, did you enjoy it? And the group 1 kids not so much. Group 2 and 3, yeah. And then when they were told to tell a stranger about their feelings about these tests, group 2 and 3 told the truth, whereas 40% of group 1 lied about it as well. So this really shows that this fixed, what's the actual term? I gotta, so this fixed mindset idea can be really destructive and damaging to people as well. Like, just to say, oh, you're so smart. It's like, well, yeah, that's a compliment, but be careful with that.
Yeah.
Because it's, that can
it's the wrong way to motivate.
You can give a kid a complex.
Yeah. It doesn't work well if you want to motivate them to try hard things in the future. They're going to think that they just succeeded on what they succeeded on because they're already intelligent enough. And then when something hard comes along, they're not going to think, I could work harder and figure this out. They'll just be like, I'm not smart enough for this. That's basically what happens is you trigger that mode of thinking, and whether it's a fixed view of your intelligence or a malleable view. And
what's interesting,
and how you praise somebody.
What's interesting is it triggers you into interpreting what error is telling you differently. Mm-hmm. Like at the core fundamental of how you look at error. Yeah. Instead of, in one way it's like, well, error tells me that I'm stupid. And on the other end, error tells me that I'm not working hard enough, but there's something I can do. So you're getting the idea that either you're helpless in this world and you're stuck with the traits that you have, or if you work hard on something, if you try another angle, if you persist, you might be able to figure it out. So that gives you a totally different perception of reality. It's actually it's a pretty standard anime trope for shonen anime or whatever. Basically, fighting animes, you will have two characters that are usually friends or frenemies or whatever you want to call it, and one of them is the pure potential kid, right? If any of y'all have seen Hunter x Hunter, Gone, the little kid, he's already really talented and kind of a freak of nature anyway, but he's always about trying harder, and even when he gets the crap kicked out of him, he's trying to learn to figure out what did I do wrong, how do I get better, whereas the other guy is the guy that's good at it, smart, and more fixed. Was Goku versus Vegeta, if you want to go Dragon Ball Z, right? And the problem that person has is now a bunch of doubt, because now they're seeing their frenemy or their partner moving up and moving through, and then eventually the character has to have the breakthrough into the malleable understanding of what the errors mean. I'm a failure and I'll never be able to do it, but I've failed. What do I need to do to remedy this problem? So it seems like intelligence is fixed, right? But
Yeah.
it also seems like intelligence is malleable. So maybe it's
Hmm.
that intelligence is fixed, but rationality is highly malleable, right?
Yes.
Because
How
you
well you
can't
can
make
use
yourself
whatever
more.
intelligence you
Yeah,
have is what's
yeah,
malleable. So you might only have 80 or 100 IQ, but you could see a marked difference
yeah,
in the seeming awareness or consciousness of
yeah,
200 or 80 IQ people side by side,
yeah. Yeah, you can
and
make your
because of how they've learned to process and use the intelligence that they have.
and invite in the opposite end too. You know, you could have somebody who's really smart that's a terrible problem solver
Hmm.
because,
And it
well,
does
a
seem that
variety
you
of
can
things. But
impact your own IQ. Yeah.
yeah, and you know, it's like I don't want to confuse intelligence with being smart. I think smart, as we know it, is you have a baseline intelligence and then your ability to use
A
it,
lot of
right?
what we mean when we say someone's smart, we're often actually alluding to their wisdom and
Yeah,
their ability to solve problems. They might not be like a great mathematician that has
yeah,
lots of
right.
facts memorized, but they might be really good at identifying and solving
Well,
problems.
like, you know, the old man sitting on the porch that's just been a
Hmm.
country bumpkin of all of his life, but seems to have a really good grasp on what life is, living a good
Hmm.
life, and all that really
Hmm.
deep, profound stuff.
Oh
Never
yeah.
spent any time in a, you know, like in a library reading
But he knows
philosophy,
people. He
but
knows
yeah,
social
you know,
interaction.
watched, changed
Yeah.
himself, you know,
He knows
like,
self-sufficiency. He knows,
yeah.
yes, lots of skills, all different kinds
Well,
of
so
skills.
it's funny, you know, like a lot of this stuff is relatively new, but the stories we've been telling for eons have
Well, this is,
characters that are moving
yeah.
through this from, you know, you know, what, you know,
Oh, the hero story. Yeah.
you know,
The development of the hero character. I really love this study because you see that. So the first trait, the kids that were told, "Oh, you got the questions right. You did so good because you guys are just so smart." Well, they weren't as interested in trying harder problems. The next group
yeah,
that said, "Wow, you guys did really good on this. You succeeded because of your hard work.
yeah,
Your effort is what made this possible. I can tell you learned a lot because of the effort you put in." They're excited
yeah.
when they get
It's like,
asked,
yeah, let's
"Hey, you
do
want
it.
to try another set of problems, ones that are a little bit harder?" Instead of saying no, like the first group, they're like, "Yeah." They have a hunger for cognition. They enjoy the harder problems. So
The interesting part in that though
right here. So we can
is,
praise the trait or we can praise the process. And
well,
we want to choose which mode are we trying to trigger in people when we're educating them.
yeah, and what's interesting though is group three, which was neutral, still were doing better off than those that were praised for their fixed trait.
That's right.
So it's showing that actually a fixed trait method is detrimental, not
Yeah.
worse, you know, just not as good as the malleable end,
Well,
but
we like,
actually detrimental because
yeah,
you have malleable end, neutral. So
neutral.
malleable's maybe a
So
little
at
bit
least
better
you're
than
not
neutral.
being told that you don't have any self control over this
Yeah, but
outcome.
then as soon as you
It's
introduce
neutral.
that fixed state,
As
oh,
soon as you introduce that idea that there's nothing you can do, this is just how smart you are,
hmm,
that throws everything off.
yeah,
You need to have some openness, some encouragement, some motivation to try. And so we are literally, when we're praising the trait, we're disallowing children that room to realize that, oh, I have my own self capacity in this.
yeah,
I have my own power
and
here.
you're creating a natural limitation now to
Yeah.
achievement.
Yes.
Because well, if I'm this smart and I had this much trouble with it, I can't do anything harder because I already had this. See,
Yeah.
I'm already
I was
here and I
smart
can't.
enough to get praise for being smart, but what if the next problems are
Yeah,
harder than I can do? I don't want to lose this
yeah,
praise. I don't want to not be considered smart anymore, so I'm not going to try. But it's a totally different mindset
hmm,
when you look at you accomplished this because you tried hard. That means that, okay, so there's a limit, but I'm able to increase that limit when I try harder.
yeah,
When I
yeah,
put some
yeah.
effort in, all of a sudden I can go further than I thought.
Yeah, as in, you know, the bar can be raised, and it's good that you can raise it,
Yeah.
and you can keep up to the bar that's being
Yeah.
raised for you.
And so the bar is malleable. The bar can keep raising
Yeah.
as hard as I'm willing
Well,
to work.
you can
The
keep
bar can
raising
keep,
with the
yeah.
bar being raised instead of freaking out that the bar is going to be raised too high for me
Oh,
to
yeah, yeah.
grasp. You know what I
There
mean?
you go. That's it.
So that's a profound insight too,
Yeah,
man.
you have a sense
Because
of your own self movement, your sense of your own upward mobility, in a sense.
yeah, because you know, like how often do we just casually, you know, tell kids or even just people, oh, you're so smart, or you're so pretty, or
Yeah.
you know,
Well, that takes that
oh,
certainly
you're
doesn't
so
that take
talented,
the wonder out of the future?
Yeah,
You
and
know?
then it stunts them. Like instead of saying, "Oh, you're so pretty" or "You're so handsome," it's like, "Wow, you put yourself together really well." That took effort. That took
Yeah.
time. That took
When it's the
intention.
malleable mode and you're praising the
Yeah.
process,
Or
you're
you
thinking to
clean up
yourself, I
nice.
wonder
You
how
know.
intelligent I could be.
Yeah.
Instead of, oh, this is, I'm just intelligent now. I think I'm smart because someone said so.
Yeah.
But if something really challenging comes along, and then I automatically like always turn away from it and ignore it. Now I'm just like, how smart could I possibly
Yeah.
become?
Yeah. Right.
There's no cap. It's just about how hard am I willing to work.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the core beautiful fundamentals of Western society as a whole is this idea that you know what, damn it, if I work really really hard, I can make my chances better to have a really good life,
That sounds
make that
rational.
money,
That's
and
and that it's because it is that's the underlying key to rationality right there.
as
That is
long as
rationality.
nobody's putting their thumbs on the scale unfairly, yeah, you can do it.
Yep. So the way intelligence recursively relates to itself is rationality.
Hmm.
The recognition that I have a highly malleable
Hmm.
cognition and capacity
Hmm.
for engaging with life is rationality itself. The willingness to go through that exercise of that
Hmm.
self-improvement is our own rationality. This is beautiful. So 40% of the trait focus, the ones that were praised for, oh, you're so smart,
Lied about their
they lied
feelings.
about their success when they were asked about it when they were asked to tell someone else about it. Whereas the group that was focused on process, that was just praised for how hard they worked, they told the truth, even if they got some wrong.
I don't think it was a success. It was about how they felt about it. So being honest about their feelings about the
Lied
whole.
about their success,
Oh, is that it? Okay?
I think is what I wrote, but I could have
But well, either way, it's
gotten that
your
wrong.
feelings or your success lying about it. It's like you could go one way and be like, "Oh yeah, I wasn't worried about it at all." Like,
Yeah,
okay, even though they're like,
yeah.
"Man, I'm just right at the edge, man," and luckily I got through. Whereas the other kids were just like, "Yeah, it was tough, but
But you made an honest self-reflection, an honest
yeah."
self-assessment. So that is allowing you to be more rational because you know what you still need to learn.
It's kind of
You
like
know where your gaps are, you know where your strengths are. So how we identify with our intelligence relates to how well we can utilize it to be more rational
hmm,
and thus more wise. So that self-honesty
yep.
is key as well.
So
Yeah.
it makes you a little bit more honest too when you
Yeah.
don't have this fixed cap to your growth.
Yeah.
Or, well, you don't even have growth in the fixed end. It's just it's as
If you
smart
want
as
to
you're
be
ever going to
true,
be.
you want to know what's true. And if you want to
Yeah.
know what's true, you want to be true. You're going
Yeah,
to get
yeah,
closer to it. Yeah.
yeah.
You're going to be willing to see where you might be wrong. So you're going to be able to run through those biases and those frames that are a little bit wrong and correct for them.
And want to do it too, and feel good about doing
Yeah,
it.
and feel good about doing
Even
it.
though the process might be grueling and excruciating.
At times, yeah. Yeah.
Actually, interesting.
And it can be that way, especially with our own particularly closely held views. When we start to self-check and challenge our own most closely held views, it certainly can be upsetting for us.
It's interesting. So the military, when you go through boot camp, what they do is they are attempting. Well, they used to. It's a little different nowadays, from what I hear, but they break you down into nothing. You are literally worms that go through the dirt. So then you have nothing
And
but
build you
up
back
to
up.
go. So
Yeah.
they're removing the fixture that it is your understanding. Yeah, I'm already in shape and I'm smart and all that.
They
No,
are
you
definitely
are maggots, groveling maggots. And if you get through this, you might be less than maggots. But
grinding
you're
that
gonna have
ego
to,
down and making you build up a healthier
yeah, and then realize that every time
personage.
the bar is raised, you're meeting it, and then actually truly being like, okay, yeah, I can take on I can take on having people shoot at me.
It helps
you
people
know?
to form a healthier personality. Yeah.
And
That
it's
is a humbled personality.
it's not coincidence that the military does this either. Some of the greatest psychological minds have helped design how the military trains.
And we've been doing this for thousands of years too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've built traditions around it. It also helps build camaraderie between people and stuff like that. But, those having
But
traditions
basically
that
taking
bond.
everyone with all these different levels of self-confidence and breaking them all down to the same level and then building them up together on the same
Yeah.
basis, it definitely helps create that camaraderie.
Hmm.
And it also helps to answer for a lot of the different kind of kinks in different people's egos, that, you know, the different habituations that people get stuck in.
Does it get rid of it completely? No.
No,
Of
but
course not. And none of this stuff we're talking about is the be all end all solution to our problems. It's just
Right.
helping us find the more core problems and issues and start to try to address them and do it over and over and over again. So, you know, we can get better at doing this and then get better at becoming wise, if you will.
Yeah.
There's
yeah,
no
we're trying
maximal
to,
ability to get wise. It's not.
to understand ourselves, we need to understand where we've come from, where we've gone through in this human story. So Vervaeke does a tremendous job of that in this series, starting back in our primordial history and bringing us up to now in the modern age to understand how we develop this crisis of meaning within ourselves and then in the wider world through our societies, how we may answer for it within ourselves, and also how we may help remarry science and spirituality, which has been unfortunately divorced for the past couple thousand years. I think that will help us a great deal as well. And then to be able to create a common language through the vehicle of cognitive science, to be able to talk about higher states of consciousness that our religious and wisdom traditions talk about, and to be able to bring our various religious and spiritual wisdom traditions into conversation, give them a common language, along with the common language they can share with science now as well. That's what Vervaeke's been doing, and that's the real breakthrough here.
Taking the ineffable and making it effable.
Making it at least accessible and communicable together, so that we can use the same language to talk about it.
Well, because, you know, like something like a metaphysical interaction with the DMT space machine elves
right.
is not necessarily an effable thing that you can quantify. Okay, and this amount, no, but there's ways, or like, you know, the feeling you get when you go to, you know, a church service in a huge cathedral, and that feeling as well. That's something that you can't quantify. But with this, we can
at least talk about what is a higher state of consciousness, what is anagoge,
well, and then,
how can we bring these states about, how are they useful for people, why are they?
Ideally figuring out a way to be able to measure it reliably across many different, you know, peoples and experiences, because if you want to study something, you have to be able to measure it in one way or put a measure to it in one way or another, you know. And for the longest time, the spiritual was not something that you could directly put a ruler to.
Yeah, and this also helps us solve the problem of how to create AGI and create artificial general intelligence that is actually going to be safe and helpful for the human species. It's going to have wisdom written into it as well, because human intelligence without wisdom is already dangerous enough. You know, once we put that into a supercharged AI system, it's a whole other level of danger for our species that we don't even know how to reckon with. We just know we have to do something and do it quickly if we are going to achieve AGI at all. But even to build in any kind of wisdom to help better serve the algorithms, better serve human beings at this point is integral.
Yep.
Needs to be happening. All right, guys. Well, it's about that time. We're going to jump into it now. It's episode 43 of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. If you guys are enjoying this series, make sure to go over to John Vervaeke's channel and smash that like and that subscribe button over there. And make sure that you like and subscribe Actuali as well if you're enjoying what we're doing here. We appreciate you guys joining us. You can always listen to this podcast on Spotify, Apple, any of the major podcast platforms. It's available for you guys anytime. Without further ado, let's jump on in.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Last time we took a look at the work of Stanovich and sort of culminating ideas coming out of the rationality debate. Tried to expand the notion for you of need for cognition. Talked a little bit more about problem finding and the generation of a problem nexus, and then also the affective component of that, wonder and curiosity, and sort of balancing them off together. And then more specifically looked at Stanovich's theory of foolishness, which he calls disrationalia, and we looked at the idea of dual processing, S1 and S2, and the idea that what makes you foolish is S1's functioning that makes you leap to conclusions, interferes with the inferential processing of S2. You leap to conclusions inappropriately, and that's what causes you to be biased in your processing, self-deceptive, foolish, etc. And then what active open-mindedness does is it foregrounds S2 and protects it from undue interference from S1. And that's all very good in a theoretical context, but we took a look at the work of Jacobs and Teasdale and said, but in a therapeutic context, the opposite is the case. What you need is that machinery of leaping to work well. And we took a look at the work of Baker, Sennett, and Ceci showing that ability to leap, cognitive leaping, is actually very powerfully predictive of insight. And that's what you need in therapy. You need insight, powerful kinds of insight to break you out of the ways in which you're confronting existential entrapment and inertia, ignorance, and you cannot infer your way through transformative, qualitative change. So I proposed, and Teasdale also has independently proposed this, that we need a cognitive style that foregrounds S1, puts us into a state for triggering insight, tends to background and constrain S2 processing, that inferential argumentative processing, and that's mindfulness. We have evidence that mindfulness facilitates insight, and mindfulness is also increasingly being incorporated into therapeutic settings precisely for its capacity to generate cognitive flexibility and afford insight. So we're noticing that what we're needing is, because the relationship between S1 and S2 is opponent and not adversarial, we're going to need some higher order way of coordinating these two cognitive styles, active open-mindedness and mindfulness, so that we can optimize the enhancement in rationality of the relevance realization that is at the core of our intelligence. And then it took time before we passed to explicit theories, psychological theories of wisdoms, to note this idea, that how you are relating to your intelligence and applying your intelligence to itself. The degree to which you problematize your own intelligence and try and improve it, we can see that as rationality. And then I proposed to you the possibility that when I do this, when I recursively and reflectively use my rationality to enhance and optimize my rationalities by enhancing perhaps the relationship between the component styles of mindfulness and active open-mindedness, then I'm moving towards wisdom. We took a look at that, and in connection with this, we took a look at the work of Dweck, and again making the argument that the way you relate to your higher cognitive processes, your meaning-making, problem-solving capacity, is not just intellectual or information processing, it's deeply existential. And we saw the work on mind setting, and that the way you identify with your intelligence, the way you're framing how you're identifying with your intelligence has a tremendous impact on your need for cognition, your problem solving, your behavior, your proclivity towards deception, self-deception, etc. Okay, so we've learned a lot along the way that I think has given us a good framework with which we can critically and constructively engage with some of the, I think, representative theories of wisdom. Let's remember earlier on that we already took a look at a central review of some of those theories, the work of McGee and Barber, showing us that they were not trying to give a comprehensive theory of wisdom, they were just trying to find a central feature, and the central feature was seeing through illusion and into reality. And then we took that up as, how does one get comprehensively, reliably, systematically better at dealing with self-deception? And that's how we got into the rationality debate, and that's how we're here. So we've done a lot to unpack that intuition. well, it's more than an intuition, it's a conclusion of the argument, the very careful argument made by McGee and Barber, that at the core of wisdom is what I would argue is rationality, the systematic and reliable ability to overcome self-deception. Now let's take all of this and, as I said, let's put it into dialogue with some existing theories. The first theory I want to take a look at isn't a comprehensive theory of wisdom, but nevertheless it's instructive because it brings up some core components of the theory of wisdom, and it does something that's exemplary, something we need to consider. It discusses the relationship between wisdom and virtue, which is an idea that's taken up explicitly by one of the core theories of wisdom, which is the work of Baltzan Staudinger, known as the Berlin paradigm. But before we do that, in order to examine the connection between wisdom and virtue, I want to take a look at the work of Schwartz and Sharp. And Schwartz and Sharp, and it's 2006 is the main article. Later on, there was a book written, I think 2010, called Practical Wisdom, which is much more extensive, but I'm relying on this article because I think that was a sort of clear and concise presentation of the argument. The article is called Practical Wisdom, Aristotle Meets Positive Psychology. Well, Aristotle you know about, and he's been invoked and discussed repeatedly. The positive psychology, remember we talked about this when we were talking about 4E cognitive science. Remember what positive psychology is about. Positive psychology is the idea that we should study the mind not only how it breaks down into its parts, we should also study it in terms of how it excels as an integrated system as a whole, because that excellence, that excelling beyond, can often reveal powers and principles at work within our mind that normal cognition and pathological cognition do not reveal. So, positive psychology studies states that are considered excellent. Now, what Schwartz and Sharp are interested in is they're interested in some work done by Peterson, not Jordan Peterson, another Peterson. Peterson and Seligman, where they're discussing virtue. And they're discussing virtue, of course, as a form of human excellence. And so they study, they list a bunch of virtues, and Schwartz and Sharp sort of stand aside from that, and they note some difficulties with this idea, this list of virtues. You know, that you should be honest, you should be courageous, right? Things like that. Notice what we have here. The presentation of the virtues carries with it the strong implication that they're logically independent from each other. Or to use language you're familiar with, what we're given is a feature list of virtues. We're given a feature list of virtues without any indication of how they relate to each other. In fact, there seems to be the assumption that they're logically independent from each other. A very questionable assumption, right? And instead, what we should be looking for is a feature schema. We should be looking for a structural functional organization that helps to explicate and explain how virtues relate to each other. So it's important to note that the feature list carries with it the implication that what you should simply do is maximize each virtue, and right away that tells you an inadequacy of the feature list. I mean, if I maximize honesty, if I'm always as honest as I can possibly be, I will at times be cruel. I will have given up on kindness, right? If I meet people and say, oh, I need to tell you, you're looking uglier than you did yesterday. I need to tell you that. Because it's being honest, maximally honest, right? We don't think of that person as being excellent. We think of that person as being an asshole, right? And so that's important. That's important right away to notice that we're not trying to maximize the virtues. We're trying to get some optimal relationship between them. And the ancients had, at least the ancient Greeks, had a very stronger version of this. They had the idea that the virtues were actually significantly interdependent with each other. And there's two ways in which they could be interdependent. They could form an interdependent system, or they could all be different versions of some core ability. I might come back to that if I have time, but I want to get into the core argument. So the core argument is, right, we should talk about the relationship between the virtues. And as soon as we do that, we can see some important issues coming to bear. So what they do is they talk about a couple of situations in which we can see virtues in conflict with each other. So one example they give is, well, an example that relates to something I just said. They give the example of you're a bridesmaid, and right, time is running out, and you're with the bride, or at least the intended bride. What's the metaphysical status before the wedding? Are you a bride? Or like a potential bride? I don't know. Anyways, they're with that person, and right, they're trying on wedding dresses, and time is running out, and right, they're asking you, well, how do I look? And if you're caught between, being honest, being kind, and being helpful, right? You could just be totally kind. And, you look wonderful. Oh, you're beautiful. That's maybe not the right thing to do, right? You could be honest. You look ugly. It's hideous, right? That's such a mistake. Or you could try to be helpful, like we're running out of time. But then what do you say? And how do you balance them all? Do you just give up honesty? Do you just lie? No. Do you give up kindness? Are you just brutal? No. Do you forget that you're trying to be helpful and you're under time constraints? No. What do you do? Right? Another example they give is, right, this is one that's pertinent to me. You're grading an assignment for a student. Right? Now the student has, they've made terrific progress. They've really overcome some barriers. They've gone from a low C, and they've been improving, and they're getting into a high B. Now, if I try to grade this paper as completely objectively as I possibly can, there's a good chance that feedback will stop that arc, will stop that growth, and the person will remain a B student. But if I just give them a little bit of encouragement, if I extend it, and is this lying? Because what am I doing with marking? Am I marking what they've done, or am I also simultaneously indicating what they can do? So if I give them a little bit more, if I push them into the A range, that might actually, like in a self-fulfilling prophecy, lift them into an A student. And what's my moral obligation here? Is my moral obligation to give them brutally objective truth? Or is my moral obligation to make them and afford them to be the best student they can possibly be? What do I do? What do I do? Okay, what these dilemmas make clear is that the virtues are not independent from each other. And we're not trying to maximize between them, we're trying to optimize between them in an important way. Now, this brings up some very important issues, right? So, what it brings up is when we take a look at the dilemmas, we start to see some important, these issues of conflict, we start to see some important things about our relationship to the virtues. Let me read a quote from you. Real life situations do not come labeled with the needed virtues or strengths attached. Notice how this is the categorization, the demonstrative reference, and right, all the stuff we talked about. And notice how they zero right in on it, because notice what they say next. There is thus the problem of, here it is, and this word is emphasized in the original, there's the problem of relevance. Which is the relevant virtue to bring to bear? And then, of course, not only is that, so you see that, do I bring is honesty the relevant virtue in these examples? Is mentorship the relevant virtue? Guidance, good guidance? Is kindness? is being helpful. Like, what are the relevant virtues? And of course, what's also shown is the virtues can conflict with each other. They often pull you into different kinds of behavior. Different kinds of behavior. Now let's bring another thing back. We often, and this is something that Schwartz and Sharp are going to make a lot out of, we often represent virtues with rules. And we've talked about this when we talked about rules. Remember, right? Remember this rule, and this is a virtue rule. Be kind. Do you remember the problem with that? Right? That rule doesn't specify its conditions. It doesn't specify, this is the problem with specification, it doesn't specify its conditions of application. Being kind to my son is not the same thing as being kind to my partner. It's not the same thing as being kind to my students. It's not the same thing as being kind to my friends. It's not the same thing as being kind to a stranger. It's not the same thing as being kind to a stranger on the street and being kind to a stranger, somebody I've just met at a funeral. These are all different. Remember that? That's why you can't capture relevance, your cognitive commitment in a rule, because you'd have to just get an ever-expanding penumbra of rules for how to apply and specify that rule. Rule application, specification, depends on relevance realization. In fact, unlike Schwartz and Sharp, I think all the problems they list, right, the problem of relevance is clearly a problem of relevance realization. The problem of conflict is a problem of determining which is more important, right? And the problem, as I've just argued, of specification is also a problem of determining relevance. I would add, so they specify these three interconnected problems, as I've argued: relevance, conflict, and specificity. I would add a fourth that they don't talk about, and this has to do with the fact that sometimes the best response to a situation is to realize that I need to develop a virtue that I do not have.
What's up? We are back. All right, let's do a quick review over the first 20 minutes we just viewed, 20-ish. So we're talking about
So it's
the relationship of wisdom and virtue.
McGee and Barber.
Well, there are Schwartz and Sharp.
Well, so before that, though, McGee and Barber stated that the core of wisdom is rationality.
Oh, yeah.
And then we got into the theories of wisdom, and theory one being from Schwartz and Sharp, and a article in 2006 called "Practical Wisdom: Aristotle Meets Positive
Psychology.
Psychology. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's all like me.
Yeah. And then there's a book as well, Practical Wisdom.
Yeah, which was 2010, I think. But
So the idea behind the book, behind the research, was to study how it excels, how wisdom excels, not just to understand the parts of it. So we're looking at studies that have considered excellence.
yeah, and excellence in the sense of going, I guess, going past the norm. Whereas like negative psychology is what goes wrong and how does it break. This is how does it go past its normal state and continue.
Yeah,
onward.
so states of excelling.
That's
not just understanding just the parts and the features of those states, but how is that person or that trait excelling in that circumstance, in that situation.
And so virtue can be seen as a form of excellence. It's something that goes past, beyond, we'll say
The norm,
beyond the norm. So you can say outward, excel, exterior. There might be something about something with that, but so virtue is a form of excellence.
So rather than looking at virtue as with a feature list,
it's not a feature list of
different traits that add up to
so I think that's
excellence.
Schwartz and Sharp's argument against the feature list, looking at the virtues as a feature list because it doesn't show the relationship between the features,
between the different virtues that make up like that state of excellence.
Yes.
So we need a structural functional organization.
Yeah, and a schema.
A scheme,
So
to be our foundation to understand this And
So the feature list implies there's a maximization of the virtues. You need to maximize any one of the virtues, you know.
yeah, and if you just maximize the virtues, then you're going to get the excellence that you're looking for. But it doesn't work that way.
No, because if you're too honest, you're an asshole.
Exactly. So in interpersonal, you know, communication and life situations we find ourselves in, like the bride argument that he gives us. You know, the bride's trying on the dress. Are you going to be 100% honest, 100% kind, or 100% helpful? And what you got to find is a kind of a marriage of the three of those. You don't want to be completely honest all the time.
Yeah.
Like he says, if someone's not looking particularly good one day, you don't tell them that they look ugly. It's like, yeah, how honest do you want to be?
Sometimes you're gonna be like, yo, bro,
but there's a way.
You look like shit. What's going on? Like
there's a way to put it though.
Depending on the relationship, you know, it's like what he was talking about with be kind. What do you mean, like kind, like to my lover, kind to my father, kind to a stranger? Like, what do you mean?
It's different depending on the relationship. Yeah.
So that's where you have problems that arise that you can observe through observing the relationships of the virtues to each other.
That's what we want to do, and that's what Peterson and Seligman figured out, is that we're not trying to maximize the virtues themselves, but create an optimal relationship between these different virtues of virtues such as kindness, honesty, helpfulness, what have you.
Yeah, and just
we should talk about that relationship between them to understand how that excellence is achieved.
Because just dropping one of them out, like say, well, I don't want to be too honest because I don't want to break her heart and tell her that her butt looks big in that dress. So I'm just going to be kind and helpful. Well, if you drop out the honesty part, you're also not being helpful because they were asking your opinion.
Yeah.
There's a relationship between being honest and the helpfulness of it, and being kind and the helpfulness of it. And to be helpful, what does that mean? Like,
it's got to be useful knowledge.
Do you just want her to feel like the best looking bride ever and whatever? And that might be. So like, which one do you foreground?
Because the virtues can't conflict, and they can pull us into different kinds of behavior. So yeah, which one do you want to? How do you want to balance these different considerations?
So
so we need to optimize, not maximize, real life situations,
and try to figure out what moral obligations do we have.
There's the problem of relevance, because our real life situations don't come labeled with the virtues that are needed attached to them. So we do have to recognize what is the relevant virtue to bring to bear in any given situation. So, and we often represent virtues with rules, and there's a problem there. Rules don't specify the conditions that we're applying. And like you were saying, there's a different kind of kindness that you're going to have with your boys versus with your mate or your kids or your grandparents or whatever.
Well, imagine this, like say you have a daughter and you just come up to her and pinch her cheek and just say, "You are just the cutest thing on the planet." You might not want to do that to your wife. You might at some certain point be able to do that to your mom and just pinch her cheeks and have her get flustered at you. But see, like we talked very early on in this whole series, what is relevant, and we gave the example of the fire. If you ain't got no family or any pets, people in the house is not the first thing. It's like your paperwork. Maybe your guitar, your PlayStation. Sorry, I'm singling out.
But it's amazing how we have this cognition, this capacity within us that we have termed relevance realization here with Vervaeke, has provided this term for us that allows us to narrow in and focus in on what is relevant in any given moment immediately.
Yeah. And so since virtue, with this rule thing, you can't really rule a virtue, and he gave the example, be kind. Be kind. That's not specific enough.
It's not.
And then it's like, well, then, to your mom, or be kind to your dad, or this, that, or the other, you'll never be able to write sub rules for it because it's combinatorially explosive. You just get more and more and more.
The only one word answer we have for that is be loving, because that at least is telling us to be considerate and to look at something deeply and to give it a full reflection.
Yeah. So we have...
It gives you an orientation, at least, that you can take on.
So it's relevance. Which one of these virtues is most relevant at the time?
Right.
How do virtues that all share a certain amount of relevance conflict with each other, how can we be very specific about it? Because you can't, right, the rule just be kind. Now, but because it's not specific enough, so you got to be specific. So therefore, you can't just make a rule that you live by and be fine.
Yeah.
And
so how are we going to create maxims to guide ourselves that are a little bit more reasonable?
Yeah, and that these were the three that they gave us, and then Vervaeke argued for then putting in a fourth and paying attention to the development.
Yes.
And developing
how we develop
your system of virtues and how you work with them.
And that's why we've looked at these ancient mystery schools, these ancient wisdom schools of spiritual systems throughout history, to see what's worked before, and also to look at why we're becoming refascinated with them. Because while we're having a meaning crisis and a breakdown of society, at the same time we're also having a refascination in the ancient wisdom of ascension, of self-transcendence, of self-realization. So there's this great interest in Stoicism and Buddhism and other ancient wisdom traditions here in the West now that has been growing. And that's been growing for a reason, it seems, that somehow innately, unconsciously, we as a species, in large groups, even as large as our own nations, whole societies, we're starting to recognize something's getting off. I need a deeper answer for how to comport myself to the world today.
And it's funny, like how it came to the United States. If you look back on it, that the hippies and the mystics and all that in the United States, they were silly. They were like silly kids having fun and running around. Yeah, but that makes sense though, because they're developing these personalizing them. And you start out with a growing understanding as the babe, and then you grow up through it. And now, I'm seeing a quite sophisticated adulthood, adult college level, if you will, look at this idea of ascending as a person and becoming more virtuous, by fact that we have professors like Vervaeke and other people that are very seriously taking this endeavor and putting it out there for the world. It's a lot more serious. It's not as silly and running around in the sun and banging and taking drugs and dropping out and going to India and having that experience and then doing all that, because that's what you do when you're a kid. You're just I'm not saying the taking drugs thing, but kids made their own drugs. You just spin around in circles and then go.
You go out, you experiment. You do crazy shit, and crazy stuff. And
that leads me to have some hope, because then eventually, if we keep doing this right, we'll come to the sage level, and I think our species will probably have a much better time at stabilizing itself at the more sage level. Hopefully, understanding of human ascension. And
it does feel like there's a little bit more sophistication in the approach today. Like you were saying, in the 60s, there's a lot of joy and fun and newness to it. There weren't that many serious players in the wisdom game, but there were a few. But now you have quite a larger number more now. It's where we can't track them anymore, and we're not holding them up kind of as like stars of like Jiddu Krishnamurtis and Ramana Maharshis and Albert Einsteins and the few like people that kind of were shining particularly bright. That we can think of like off the top of our heads.
Yeah, but the light is just as bright. It's just diffused across a broader surface.
I think now of very serious thinkers that are also deep practitioners of mindfulness practices of some sort, whether they're deeply religious.
I think the internet really helped with that,
or they're deeply spiritual in some other fashion. But they're also serious thinkers on the, at once.
Yeah,
and we've needed that to happen again in our world, because we have been hungering for wisdom. It's like we have the technology of gods without the wisdom of gods.
Yeah, right.
The Daniel Schmachtenberger quote there.
Well, we might just very well in a very short period of time create lowercase g gods, God, with our internet system and AIs, and once we get to a distributed general artificial general intelligence. I mean, that's game changing.
Yeah. Well, so I feel that what Vervaeke's put his finger on is the most urgent matter of our day that helps us to solve for other. This is the problem that helps solve for the other problems. This is developing a really great problem nexus for our species right now, basically.
Yeah.
This is where the problem is. If you can solve this problem, it's going to ripple out and affect everything else and help improve everything else.
Yeah, and
And so if we can't solve this meaning crisis and this complex disjointing and fragmentation that's occurring across our various societies across the planet, and it's happening all over the world right now, we're seeing a breakdown of our understanding of our connection with reality, with one another, with our idea of what is God, how does one serve and live honestly, and what is goodness in this world today. All of these questions are up in the air, and we're having to nail them back down and recapitulate our understanding of a relationship with that great mystery, this existence, this life we find ourselves in. We're having to re-understand all of that together right now, and then individually within ourselves to find a way to relate with this world as we're going through this time of increasingly rapid change. And like you were just saying with AI, with all the great problems that we face, and there's a term, the meta crisis, for the many existential, life-threatening crises that face our species that are occurring at once and that are penetrating and interacting and exponentiating one another.
And so words are funny. When we say problem, there are problems that are crises that are bad things, but then there are, say, like what Vervaeke's doing with this 50-part lecture series is he is problematizing for us so we can see what the components are, because a problem isn't necessarily something that's bad. Like a math problem isn't bad. You know, figuring out how to get the angles right on a house that you're building.
Yeah, this is kind of just what's happening. This is part of our human evolution.
I think a problem is a set of conditions and constraints, knowns and unknowns.
Yes.
And components all working together that can be organized to be understood. And then there
like a puzzle in a Zelda game.
And, you know, we got our problems as a human species, and some of them are what we, you know, colloquially call that word.
Got some things that we could call some bad problems.
Bad problems, like a bad thing, but not, you know, like problem, you know, just be a problematizer. Figure out how to put things in a form, you know, a formula, figure it out, really work through them.
Help take the weight out of this whole thing, and by taking this zooming back telescopic view of reality and being like, oh, that's right. We are a self-aware species that has grown out of a somehow living planet that finds itself rotating around this giant burning ball of plasma that we call a star, and there's trillions, countless of those more out there in infinite space as far as we can see. We have some understandings of the makeup of the particles in the universe, but no explanation as to how the thing could have possibly begun, besides the point of a Big Bang maybe, but what came before or why it's here. We have no answers for any of this stuff. We
don't even know why, why an electron does.
But we know that this is like a miracle. Yeah. What we use the word miracle for is whatever's happening here is very special and remarkably rare as far as we can tell. And it's happening, and here we are experiencing life together, entertaining one another with our music and our art and our film and our creations. And we have a set of conditions that there's a challenge for our species ahead of us. And there are, you could say, some bad aspects as far as undesirable outcomes and events that can occur. But it is helpful to put the whole thing in that beautiful cosmic perspective, to realize that it's also a moment of great potential. As much as there is a lot of darkness in our world, in our current times, and our view of the future, you know, our obsession with dystopian film and dystopian movies, you know, I mean, it's everywhere, and it's there for a reason. You know, we started out with the first episode of this talking about our fascination with zombies and end of the world scenarios and our storytelling, and it is there for a reason, to help us understand how we cope with these kinds of situations, because they are perennial problems. They're recurring issues that do continually come back. But you know, you just reminded me that when you looked at your phone there, that we are rattling on. We should jump back in before we get carried away here, guys. So let's do that. We're jumping back in. It's episode 43 of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis on Wisdom and Virtue. Follow along. Here we go.
It's an aspirational response. rather than a select, which of my virtues should I apply, or how do I specify it? It might be, oh, geez, I'm lacking a virtue that I need. I need to cultivate a virtue that I do not have. So I would add in, right, in addition to the problem of relevance, conflict, and specificity, there's the problem of development, the need to aspire to acquire virtues you do not have. And I've already shown you how much that developmental process is dependent on capacity for insight and qualitative transformative experience, etc. All right. So what are they proposing? They're proposing that we need a higher order. So here's the virtues, right? We need a higher order ability that deals with relevance. They put it as a list, but I've tried to show you how they're related, right? Conflict, specification, development. Well, what would that be? Well, they argue that's wisdom. They argue that that's wisdom. Wisdom is what you need. Notice what the argument they're making here. Given the fact that they are not logically independent, given that in very many situations, right, all of these issues are brought to bear, and I'm arguing, and I think it's fair, that this is it centers on the ability to determine relevance, right? You need wisdom in order to be wise. Right? In fact, one of the interpretations of the ancient Greek idea of the interdependence of the virtues is not that the virtues are all constraining on each other, but that each virtue is just a particular way in which you're wise in a situation, right? So to be kind is how to be most wise in this situation. To be honest is how to be most wise in that situation. So that version of the interdependence of the virtues really, really tightly ties the virtues to wisdom. Either way, there is a deep connection between the cultivation and the pursuit of a virtuous way of life and the cultivation of wisdom. Now, this is where Schwartz and Sharp, and this is why their book is entitled Practical Wisdom, and that's why the title of the article is Practical Wisdom, because they call back to Aristotle's distinction, right? This is the distinction between Sophia, which is in Philosophia, and Phronesis. Right? Both of these words can be translated as wisdom. This is often translated as theoretical wisdom, and then that becomes problematic because that's often assimilated to our idea of theoretical knowledge, and then we lose a lot of what Sophia is, right? And then phronesis is often translated as practical wisdom. So what Schwartz and Sharp want to argue is that phronesis is what you need for virtue. Phronesis is the ability to be very contextually sensitive, to exercise good judgment, to know what to do in this situation. So it overlaps very considerably with the relationship between procedural knowledge, knowing how to do various things, knowing how to be honest, knowing how to be kind, and perspectival knowing, a situational awareness of what is best fitted here, what is most appropriate for here, right? And so you can see clearly why phronesis is relevant. And one of the things they argue, which is very interesting, is they really resist, and I think appropriately, trying to understand phronesis as having rules. So here they're very sort of critical of a Kantian idea of being virtuous as sort of specifying as your behavior. Whether or not this is Kant's view, it's not something I'm going to get into. This is certainly a view that many people have, that the way in which you are virtuous is to have a set of rules, moral commandments, and that you follow those rules as best you can. And then what And what that can lead to, and Schwartz has been critical of this elsewhere in some talks you can find on YouTube, for example. This has been sort of, right? This can lead to the attempt to try and legislate everything, to try and specify everything in terms of how we should behave in terms of rules. And they're critical of that because, first of all, it's impossible. Notice the example of be kind. If I try to make a law that we should be kind, then I have to make laws about all these different ways in which I specify being kind. I'd have to make laws that tell me when I should give preference to kindness over honesty across all possible, like it's impossible, right? But you can get into an illusion, this is part of Schwartz's, that you can somehow replace people becoming wise with people having laws. Now, obviously, I am not proposing anarchy, like that we shouldn't have laws or etc. like that. That's not Schwartz's point. He's not proposing that. That's absurd. What he's proposing is to step back and realize that we should have, right, this balance between proposing legislation and requiring from people that they cultivate wisdom. Okay, so he's making that argument, and I think that's something that we should take into account. We should ask ourselves, right, not just will this legislation reduce harm? That's a really important question, okay, for sure. But we should also, and I think this is also an important question, will this legislation tend to make people less likely to pursue the cultivation of wisdom and virtue? Okay, so you have to think about that. Is Schwartz's argument. And I think that's an argument that should be taken seriously. And that's why, of course, he keeps making it, and he's getting a considerable audience around it. All right, okay, let's go back to the main point. They tend to leave this out because they tend to associate Sophia, I think, unfairly with the having of rules. They assimilate it, I think, too much to theoretical knowledge and the possession of propositions. Of course, rules are propositions. You're proposing what people should do, proposing very strongly, right? And they see Sophia as theoretical knowledge, largely propositional. I think that's an unfair representation of Sophia, and other people have pointed this out. And so, whereas I think, look, this is about being very contextually sensitive, and that's very important because that allows me to generate the process needed in this situation. I need to start behaving, in this sort of balance between being kind and honest, right? But I also need this, and instead of thinking of this as rules and the possession of propositions, or sort of analogous to the Kantian model, let's think of this instead as, right, the awareness of principles. So phronesis is about getting you, right, into a process, the contextual sensitivity, the perspectival situational awareness, activating the right procedures in the appropriate way so that I fit the situation, right? That's great. But I also need a cross-contextual sensitivity. I need to pick up on things that are generalizable across different contexts, right? And of course, that is partially what we're trying to do with our laws, hence the connection. But to reduce this to just the ability to generate propositional knowledge, I think, is a mistake. That's not what Sophia is. Sophia is something like a deep kind of ontological depth perception. It's to be able to see deep underlying principles. Because what I need to know, really, and this was Aristotle's point, right? I need both of them. I need to know how to put principles into processes, and I need to know how to regulate processes with principles. That's what it is to put a principle into practice, and to practice in a principled manner. So I would argue against Schwartz and Sharp that you need both Sophia and phronesis. You need something that is trying to pick up on cross-contextual invariance, and you need something that is helping you to, and of course this is in line with the relevance realization model I've argued, something that is the aspect of wisdom that is about contextual sensitivity, what's different here, what's special here, how do I fit myself to this specific situation, as opposed to how do I generalize across these many situations. And what I want is an opponent relationship between them, so that I can discover powerful principles and put them into effective practice, and so that I can regulate my practices with well-justified principles. So I think that that's a very crucial issue. There's one other issue about Schwartz and Sharp that I want to come back to. I think they're right in saying that phronesis is a kind of know-how, a procedural knowledge. I think it's also perspectival and potentially participatory, but at least perspectival. And one of the things they do is they talk about this in terms of the language of expertise, of being an expert, which is different. And what they're trying to do with that contrast is, right, an expert doesn't necessarily possess the best theory. They don't have the knowledge that. The expert has the best know-how. Expertise is a kind of excellence in know-how. I think because they've focused in on phronesis separate from Sophia, and they've thought of know-how without thinking also of the perspectival knowing. I think this is a mistake. Here's why. I think that expertise, well, I'm trying to be careful here. There's a way in which we can equivocate with this word. We can just mean that we sometimes use this to mean just good, like, excellent. That's what expertise is. And that's a very loose way of talking. But if you're trying to use it within psychology in a more precise manner, expertise is a domain-specific thing. And we've talked about this before. Right? So I can become a tennis expert. My know-how can rise to a level of authority. And notice that my being an expert in tennis, we've done this before, but let's do it again. My being an expert in tennis doesn't give me any special authority over squash. In fact, my expertise in tennis can dramatically interfere with my playing squash. So typically what happens in expertise is it tends to be very domain specific, which is precisely why you can get very focused training on it and become very good at, like, tennis. Here's my problem with understanding phronesis, and therefore also the relationship with virtue, on the model of expertise. The domain specificity of expertise, if we're using the term carefully, is not what I need here. Right? It's not what I need. And you're saying, but phronesis is context sensitive. Yes, it is. And perhaps that's the source of the confusion. Being context sensitive isn't the same thing as having expertise. And you say, but that sounds similar. Well, let's pull it apart, right? What phronesis is, and so let's do this very carefully. Phronesis is not like expertise in tennis, which I can only apply here, and in fact, if I try to transfer it to something even similar, it will interfere. I would argue that what phronesis is my ability to be sensitive in this context, and sensitive in this context, and sensitive in this context. And that is very, very different. That is very, very different from expertise. Right. So what we need is a domain general ability. Now, this is not a contradiction. Your ability to be contextually sensitive is itself a domain general ability. I have to be able to be contextually sensitive in many different domains. And so I'm arguing that there's a bit of confusion here, and if you pull it apart, what we need is an ability, right, to be contextually sensitive, but in a domain general way across many domains. So, I think things like, intelligence and rationality, or I would argue the ability to realize relevance, which always has a contextually sensitive component to it, are much better ways of understanding phronesis than expertise, because this Those ways of talking are domain general. They have, each one of them has an aspect that is the domain general ability to be contextually sensitive here and here and here. And that's important because, you know what? You're not foolish generally in a domain-specific way. Specific domains may make you more foolish, but we all wonderfully have the ability to be foolish in almost every domain of our life. Often many domains simultaneously in a disastrous chaos. Right. So I would argue that we shouldn't confuse that phronesis is about context sensitivity with expertise, which is locked to a particular domain. We should think of something much more like intelligence, rationality, relevance realization, which can apply across multiple domains, make you a general problem solver, and deal with the domain generality of your capacity for foolishness. And so I think my two main so let's draw this together. The argument for the connection between wisdom and virtue, I think, is very powerful. Solid argument. The argument that should make us more hesitant to trying to capture wisdom just with virtue just with rules. I think that's an argument I'm sympathetic with. I think that's going in the right direction. The argument that phronesis is all we need for virtue, I question. I think, following Aristotle, that phronesis and Sophia should be in a very powerful opponent relationship, you know, trying to get principles into processes and processes regulated by principles, etc. And the idea of trying to capture the procedurality of phronesis with the notion of expertise, I think, is a confusion, as I've argued, and we should put that aside. Okay, I now want to pick up on one of the, I mean, I think this is a fair way of saying it, one of the seminal theories, psychological theories of wisdom. In many ways, this theory turned the investigation of the psychological investigation of wisdom into an experimental, empirical process. And so this is the important work of Baltz and Staudinger. It's called the Berlin wisdom paradigm. They're both working in Berlin. Obviously, they're German. And so what I want to do is go to their, it's always hard to tell you what to refer to, because their work shows up in multiple articles, multiple handbooks on wisdom. But the article, I think, that many people regard as sort of the seminal one is an article entitled Wisdom as a Meta-Heuristic Yielding... I'm getting the wrong quote here. Sorry, here, I just want to get into it. Wisdom, a meta-heuristic, pragmatic, to orchestrate mind and virtue towards excellence. Okay, so sorry for that little delay. Wisdom, a meta-heuristic, and then in brackets, pragmatic, to orchestrate mind and virtue towards excellence. So notice right here, the title tells you that they've deeply accepted the point made by Schwartz and Sharp, that there's a deep connection between wisdom and virtue. Orchestrating mind and virtue towards excellence, there's already the deep connection to positive psychology. But also notice something. The invocation of the term a meta-heuristic and the notion of pragmatic tells us that relevance realization is playing a very significant role in this theory. At least I will argue that. Okay. So let's first of all deal with this notion that they put in brackets of pragmatic. Because they're sort of picking up on a couple different related but not identical meanings associated with that term. One is having to do with, I think, like the pragmatic aspects of language, pragmatics. So there's syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And we talked about this when we talked about Grice and conversational implicature, right? That you always are conveying much more than you're saying, and that how that depends on capacity for relevance realization. And you can see, and so there's that sense of that dealing with how much our communication and more broadly our cognition goes beyond what we can directly propositionally represent. That's definitely there. There's another meaning of pragmatics, and that has to do with pragmatism, which I haven't talked about. I'm going to talk about it later when I talk briefly about James. And so the idea behind pragmatism is, so sorry, like I said, there's so much there, but the idea about pragmatism, I would argue, a way of understanding it, at least a way of understanding James. James is one of my heroes. James was both a great psychologist and a great philosopher, and he was interested, so he's kind of a proto-cognitive scientist, but he isn't interested just in cognition. He's interested very much in what it is to live a good life. He starts some of the earliest work on the study of mystical experiences and religion, psychological investigation. So he's just a really pivotal figure for me and for many people. But one way I would argue is what James was on about is that you should evaluate your knowledge claims ultimately in terms of their efficaciousness, how much they can be viably used in your life in order to adapt you to the world. And so one way of thinking about this is your propositional claims ultimately have to be grounded in your procedural abilities. James doesn't use this language, but I could find passages in James that clearly point to it, I would argue, that your propositional knowing has to be grounded in your procedural abilities, which have to be grounded in your perspectival, which have to be grounded ultimately in your participatory. James was very interested in the phenomena of conversion when people go through these massive identity changes and how that changes the world that they can live in. Now, I think that's deeply right. But there are also some problems with pragmatism. I'll come back to this, so I'll just mention it now. I think there's a confusion, or at least a potential confusion, between truth and relevance, and that can be problematic. Now, why does all of that matter? Well, because, as I've just tried to show you, pragmatism tries to situate what James would call sort of your intellectual claims, right, into this deeper, lived, experienced, viable ability to fit your world, to develop your connectedness, to develop yourself. Both of those, I think, can plausibly be brought back together in the notion that what we're talking about, and then this just goes so well with the invocation of the term meta-heuristic, a heuristic for managing your heuristics. We can draw this together and this term together, meta-heuristic, right? We can draw this, right, all together with, well, having to do with realizing relevance. This is invoked, not in terms of the theoretical account I've given, but the idea that zeroing in on relevant information is crucial to wisdom. This is invoked throughout the article by Baltz and Stoniger. Let's be clear. I don't think they are explicitly making a case the way I am. What I'm saying is they're invoking ideas and making use of them that ultimately deeply presuppose the ability for relevance realization. Now, they have an account of the 5 criteria you need in order to be wise. And the point about this is to try and specify what these meta-heuristics are that bring about an excellence in our life, an orchestration of mind and virtue together so that we become excellent human beings, excellent persons. They try to specify this in terms of 5 criteria. The point of the criteria are these are the features that are needed to judge someone wise, and also these are features that can be empirically investigated. Okay, so what are these criteria? So, rich factual knowledge about the fundamental pragmatics of life, right? So this is in some sense like Sophia. This person has a deep grasp of the facts, the principles of the fundamental pragmatics of life. They also need rich procedural knowledge about the fundamental pragmatics of life. And this goes back to the McGee and Barber point, right? That wisdom is not so much what you know, but how you know. It's very much about knowing how to put these principles into practice, into process. Now, they of course have now done propositional and procedural knowledge. I think they should have gone deeper. They obviously are going to need participatory knowledge because they have to explain how we go through dramatic developmental change, because presumably qualitative change is what's needed for wisdom, hence the term excellence. Right? And of course, they are missing the perspectival knowing that connects the procedural knowing to specific contexts, situational awareness. Okay, so that I think is important. I think they're pointing towards this perspectival knowing and how it ultimately plugs into participatory when they invoke the next criteria. They call it lifespan contextualism. Lifespan contextualism. Like I say, this is a kind of perspectival knowing. This is the way in which you're taking the big picture, your ability to zoom out, and then from that big picture zoom in as needed, right? So it's this perspectival knowing. And that, I think, is very crucial. I think it has a lot to do with our capacities for self-regulation. We've talked about that. Now, the next one, I want to state it, and then I want to challenge it. This is, they call it relativism of values and priorities, right? I find that a hard criterion to be sort of tethered to. If they're using this term carefully, I don't think that many of the people that I would regard as quintessentially wise were moral relativists. I do not think Socrates or Plato were moral relativists. I think they're clearly the opposite. I think it's unlikely that the Buddha was a moral relativist, or Jesus of Nazareth was a moral relativist. I think we are falling prey to thinking that our liberal democratic values are constitutive of wisdom. I'm not arguing against these values. That is not what I am doing here. I'm arguing against tying the notion of wisdom to those values. I think what might be on offer here, what they're actually talking about, is a capacity for tolerance. And perhaps the way we could understand that then is, instead of a kind of relativism, we can understand it in terms that we can apply to Socrates, of a fallibilism, which is a claim that you should never assert certainty, right? We can easily attribute that to Socrates, and it seems analogous. Jesus' regular condemnation of self-righteousness seems to be appropriate here. So a kind of fallibilism, and then linked to something that you've heard me mention multiple times, humility. Right? Humility. A recognition, an appreciation of your status, your limits, etc. So if we bring in fallibilism and humility rather than requiring wise people to demonstrate moral relativism, I think we can plausibly apply this criteria to many exemplars of wisdom from the past. The fifth one, and I think this is very crucial, is recognition and management of uncertainty. Recognition and management of uncertainty. So this is to say, right, we are in the finitary predicament. Most of the time we can't do algorithmic processing. We cannot pursue certainty. We have to act as best we can within unavoidable contexts of uncertainty. So you can see why I think this theory is sort of dripping in the machinery of relevance realization. I think the term meta-heuristic is very good. I think the meta-heuristic is something that coordinates between heuristics. It might be something like an optimization within a dynamical system, like I've argued, trade-off between compression and particularization, things like that. They, at times, though, tend to talk about this meta-heuristic as a form of expertise, and I've already made the criticism. I think that's a mistake. I think that understanding wisdom as expertise is to mislead us. Again, it causes us to overfocus on the important procedural knowledge to the exclusion of the perspectival and the participatory. It also confuses, the context sensitivity with, being domain specific, and we shouldn't do that. And I've made that argument. I'm not going to make it again. Instead, I want to point out that what they tend to be arguing for is a very, very comprehensive kind of cognitive flexibility and and adaptability. That your cognition is flexible enough that it can adapt itself to different situations in a very efficacious manner. What's important is that they started to generate some empirical work. Well, how do you do this? Well, you basically train independent judges to be able to evaluate these criteria in people's behavior, their spoken behavior, right, things like that. And then what you do is you put people into various situations, often situations that might involve moral dilemmas or other more practical challenges, and you get those people to relate on how they would deal with those difficult situations. You try to find some situations that we would prototypically do this for. We would say for somebody who handled them well in that themselves in that situation, we would be quite happy with attributing wisdom to them. They'd say, yeah, if somebody managed this situation really well, that would be good evidence for me for calling them wise. Now what you do is reverse engineer that. Take those situations that, if solved successfully, would generally lead to the attribution of wisdom, give them to a bunch of people, evaluate how, in the answers that people are giving, not just sort of vaguely how well they answer it, but do they answer it in a way that exemplifies these 5 criteria? And then you can judge how well people are doing in solving these problems. And so what you got was some of the first attempts to start to empirically measure wisdom by putting people, I mean, see what they're doing? This is analogous on how we test intelligence and rationality. We give people a bunch of tests across situations, and we try to see how they do, and then we start to generate from that a measure of how wise they are. I think this is, as I said, this is just quintessentially important. So one of the things I want to bring out, they talked about the cognitive styles that are important for being wise, and that is important. Sort of a judicial style, somebody who's good at making judgments. The reason why I'm not going into that detail is they're relying on sort of notions from Sternberg and others about particular kinds of styles, and I don't really have time to go into that in depth. That would be a large chunk on itself. What it shows is how important the capacity for good judgment is for wisdom, and we sort of knew that, but as I'm trying to argue, we're getting a sense of how, like in terms of relevance realization, right, and the ability to zero in on relevant information, we're getting a sense of what that good judgment means. Now, one of the things I want to draw from Baltzan-Staudinger, or one of the experimental results, because this points to more recent and important work by Igor Grossman, is they gave people this experimental task in which they have to try and solve these problems, and they put them into 3 conditions. In one condition, they could discuss the problem with a significant other before responding. In another condition, they could imagine a virtual or internal dialogue. Notice that. Imagine a virtual and internal dialogue. Remember the Stoics and internalizing Socrates? Right? Third condition, they were just given more time to think about it. And what they found is that the first and second group clearly outperformed group 3. You're wiser if you talk to other people. And that's sort of like, duh. Yeah, but if it's duh, why do we carry around this bullshit mythology of complete individualism? So that's one interesting finding. This goes back to the Platonic dialogue, that in discussion with others, we get to a level of wisdom that we cannot get to on our own. Now, what was interesting, that's in itself an interesting, what was interesting is also there was no important difference between group 1 and group 2. Talking to another person and imagining, simulating in your mind talking to another person, that was just as good. If you can internalize other people, they can give you the metacognitive ability to overcome your biases. Now, why this, I think, is important is I think this points to more recent work done by a colleague of mine, Igor Grossman, and I've mentioned his work already, the Solomon effect. Solomon, of course, the biblical figure of wisdom, which is, if you have, what's going on with that talking with other people? Well, part of it, I think, is the Solomon effect. Right? If I describe a problem to you from the first person perspective, which I'm liable to do, especially in an individualistic culture like ours, right? I will tend to be very locked in because, again, remember the whole thing about internalization? When I'm in a perspective, it's biasing me, and one of the things I can't see, my framing is often transparent to me. I can't see it. I'm seeing through it. And when I'm in the first person perspective, I'm sort of locked here in my perspective because it is my problem. If you get people to re-describe the same problem from the third person perspective, and notice the word I'm going to have, they often have an insight. They often notice something they hadn't noticed before. They pick up and make something salient or relevant that wasn't salient or relevant from within their first person perspective. So moving outside and looking back through somebody's eyes from a third person perspective on your cognition can enhance your capacity for these wisdom tests. This is what I mean why Baltzan-Staudinger, although they're not invoking it or theoretically discussing it, right, they are relying on perspectival knowing in their experimental work. So, we're starting to make our way through these theories of wisdom. We've taken a look at Schwartz and Sharp. We've seen how the connection between wisdom and virtue is being established. Baltzan-Staudinger are picking up on that, and they're starting to get us into some of the fundamental machinery of what it is to be a wise person. I want to continue that next time, and also bring up some important criticisms of the work of Baltzan-Staudinger. You've seen me already make one. I don't think that this ability should be understood as expertise, I'll make some other ones, and those criticisms will take us into the important seminal work on wisdom by Monica Ardelt, and then we'll also take a look at the work of Sternberg, and then I will return and propose, or at least explain to you a proposal made by myself and Leo Ferraro in 2013 about how to try and draw this together in terms of this machinery that I've been advocating. And then I want to subject that theory, my own theory, to, I think, some pretty significant criticisms. And then and I hope that will point us towards how we can then reintegrate the account of wisdom with the account of enlightenment. And ultimately, resituate us back with awakening from the meaning crisis. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Oh yeah. Meow 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 meow. Rough, rough, rough. Rough, rough, rough. Rough, 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 rough.
All right, so we were at we need a higher order ability that deals with wisdom. And you need wisdom to be wise, in the sense of you need to have these components of wisdom to be wise. So we talk Aristotle's distinction of wisdom between Sophia and phronesis.
Mm-hmm. Two different words that connotate different aspects of wisdom.
So we're looking at Sophia, or right now we're looking at Sophia as theoretical and
wisdom,
and phronesis as practical wisdom. So the virtues are in there, or at least this is the argument.
Mm-hmm.
So what are their names? These guys that are making this argument.
Where was that? I think that was on the previous.
Schwartz and Sharp.
Sharp and Schwartz.
Okay.
So the ability to be very contextually sensitive, to have good situational awareness, perspectival
so
knowing.
I know where I was. So these guys, Sharp, and they resist the idea that phronesis is a rules having thing.
Mm-hmm.
They think
that's
right. The world of Sophia.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that it leads to legislation, the making of more rules and laws and more rules and laws on top of rules and laws.
An effort to try and to specify virtues into rules. Yeah. So we can confuse having laws for instilling virtues.
Yeah.
When you need to cultivate wisdom, you can't just put a law into effect and think that that's going to do the job. So there needs to be a balance.
Yeah. So, so they're actually arguing for a balancing between relevance, conflict, specification, development, or
yeah, and we'll get there.
Yes. Yeah. So the question with legislation, will it reduce the harm, but also will it make people less likely to pursue virtue?
Yes.
So,
yes. So we need to know how to put principles into the processes.
Yeah. So the reason
and
why
then imbue the processes with principles at the same time.
That's a little bit further on.
Yeah.
So they tend to leave Sophia out because of it being them believing it being largely propositional.
Mm-hmm.
A propositional claim. Now the critique here is we need to be sensitive to context. So and we need the Sophia, the awareness of context.
Mm-hmm.
But we need context in specific and in general. So not just context within one thing, but context in multiple things.
Right. It can't just be domain specific.
And that's where
be general
we need to put
well.
our principles into practice and have practice principles that have been, maintained, checked, make sure that they still hold valid to how life actually is and not the ideal of what you want life to be.
Yeah, the processes are held to the principles that are creating the processes. Yeah. So basically what we're arguing for at this point is that oppositional relationship, to recognize that it's not an either or here. Both of these need to be working in tandem.
Yeah, so
for us to understand this.
Schwartz and Fellow I guess, are arguing that phronesis and are combining phronesis with a perspectival expertise, the know-how. But so the equivocation of expertise is good, but the actual term used, scientifically is domain specific, trained in a certain specific end.
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily need expertise. We need, which is only sensitive in one context. We need something that's sensitive in multiple contexts. So this is Vervaeke's argument against the idea of phronesis and expertise.
Yes, and the argument for relevance realization, that's where his theory of relevance realization would fit in very well, because they're looking for a metacognitive heuristic to explain for everything when they describe their schema. So it fits very well there.
So basically, just don't confuse context sensitivity with expertise.
That's right, yeah.
It's not just looking into one thing, but looking into all things. So it can't be expertise, because the idea is to be sensitive to the context, like we were talking about before.
Yeah, because that expertise connotates not having the best theory, but the best know-how, which is a domain general kind of thing. But we need something that is both domain specific and domain general, as we were saying. Yeah, because in expertise in psychology is domain specific. Expert in one field, it doesn't transfer to another. So. Yeah. So we need something that accounts for.
But we need to be
both.
Sensitive to the context, so you can know when to tell your wife that her butt looks big in that dress, and how to in the right way, because she said she needed your opinion.
Yeah.
So you need that context. You need to be sensitive to context, but it's not a matter of being sensitive to only one issue within it. You need
Right. We got to look to wisdom, rationality, relevance realization. We can't confuse context sensitivity with expertise alone. So and we can't force virtue with rules either. They need development. So phronesis, it doesn't account for expertise alone. And then now we get to the seminal psychological theory of wisdom that Baltz and Stollinger were talking about, the meta-heuristic. A pragmatic to orchestrate mind and virtue towards excellence. Something that recognizes the connection between wisdom and virtue is basically what these guys come along calling for.
Yeah, so the word pragmatic we got into. So there's the pragmatics, as in the language, like this, you're always saying more than you can convey within words, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the pragmatism, which is you evaluating the effectiveness of your propositional claims in your life. So, being like, well, I claim this, is it working?
Yeah.
We'd say that would be, that person is.
So it's pragmatic to recognize when there's something wrong and then to fix it, because we're knowing that you can change the world that you live in. But it does, situate our intellectual claims, our understanding of the world into a viable worldview for us. So both of these definitions point to the capacity for realizing relevance. So there's some kind of relevance realization process going on here, and that must be the missing link that Vervaeke's put his finger on. And God knows what happens after the computer scientists working at the cutting edge of AI really start to grapple with what Vervaeke's working with. And I know he is working with a lot of these guys.
So Baltz.
So here we are.
Baltz and Staudinger.
The 5 criteria.
Have 5 criteria. So the first one is
the features that we need to be able to judge or investigate wisdom.
Yeah. So the first one is a rich fundamental knowledge of the fundamental pragmatics of life.
Yeah.
Like you got to be able to. Well, you got to know the stuff to know about it.
Yeah, which would also include a rich procedural knowledge, not just factual. Vervaeke's note adding this on here.
Yeah.
So let's include a procedural, the know-how, not just the what, but the how.
Yeah, you have to live the life to know the life, right?
And a participatory knowledge should be added along in there as well.
Yeah.
How to do that with others.
So that
then the perspectival knowing would be included there as well.
But that's 2, which is you need the procedural knowledge, how to do it. So the first one is you need to know what it is. Then you need to know how to do it, and then lifespan contextualism,
which
so
is the perspectival knowing.
yeah, and that's
That's a capacity
going,
for self-regulation,
yeah, that's going out as big as you can, and then also going back in
and
and
then
being able to do
your
that
capacity to
process.
be able to go zoom out and then zoom back in, and regulate your understanding of where you are in the greater scheme and the greater cosmos.
And then the fourth one he has a bit of an issue with because it's like, okay, so the relativism of values
And
and
priorities.
priorities, and John doesn't think that all the old greats were relative or moral relativists. Instead, what John's arguing for this to mean is a capacity for tolerance and what is it that
Fallibilism,
fallibilism. Man, that's a weird word. Fallibilism.
meaning to
Don't
not,
express certainty.
to never assert certainty.
Yeah. It's just and then humility, which is recognition and appreciation of where you are and what your limits are. And then this fifth is recognition and management of uncertainty.
Yes.
Which is basically just doing the best you can, knowing you're in the context of uncertainty. You cannot be certain about anything.
And we're in a constantly changing situation as well. So
Now,
just the recognition and the management of that uncertainty. So these are the 5 criteria or the factors that are needed to be able to judge the level of wisdom in somebody, or to be able to investigate wisdom scientifically at all.
So I guess the argument that these guys are making is
The levels of knowledge, their capacity to contextualize where you are in life, your capacity for self-regulation, the relativism of so basically a capacity of tolerating change in your values and priorities to keep them balanced, humility and recognizing your status and limits, and recognition of your management of uncertainty. Recognition and management of uncertainty. Wow. But Vervaeke notes at this point, understanding wisdom as expertise indeed confuses the context sensitivity with being domain specific. So while they do argue, and this is what's helpful, is for cognitive flexibility and thus adaptability to our environments. And they started doing empirical research to evaluate behaviors in various situations, how people then related on how they dealt with those experiments. And so he goes into some experiments at this point.
Yeah, I only got the last experiment, so it's 3 groups. Group 1, talk about an issue or a problem that they get the chance to talk to a significant other before responding. And the second group just imagines them having the internal dialogue. And these 2 groups do better than the third group, which is just giving them more time to think about the problem. So it seems that we need others around us for wisdom, whether or not they're real or simulated in your head.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like, like practicing something in your head, think about it, dream about it, and like actually go through the motions, whether it's shooting the
for whatever reason,
or
it works. The visualization of a discussion with an imaginary person works just as well as having another person.
Yeah, that's
because
the Solomon effect.
Through discussion itself, we get that Solomon effect, and we get a level of wisdom we can't achieve on our own. So internalizing others gives us that metacognitive ability to counter our own biases,
and
to see around our blocks in our frames.
Yeah, and this, this points to the group 1 and group 2 being better at the original wisdom test to begin with. So like just having, somebody to talk to or doing this in your head will make you better at the previous test that was designed to test for wisdom.
That's right. Yeah. So even though the third group was given more time to think about the problems, the first group that had somebody else to talk to and bounce off of, and then the second group, which was encouraged, in fact, to imagine having someone else to talk to help solve the problem. They both did just as well as each other.
Well, and
the other one.
So now we have experimental data to point to what people were talking about in the way back whens of the internal dialogue, and like
Yeah,
Not
we
just
can look
going
through the
out,
criteria.
not just going out into the marketplace,
Mm-hmm.
but you can also do it within your own mind. You can internalize other people and reflect off it, and particularly if you know them well enough or are familiar well enough.
Yeah, like
Have them,
Socrates or Jesus or Buddha or your grandfather or grandmother.
yeah,
Or
of, like a philosopher that you
anyone that
think's
you
cool.
admire. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe that's important for, maybe we should start teaching youngsters to start reading and have better role models and not internalizing the, but garbage that seems to be the popular fads
Yeah.
nowadays for what role models are.
Yeah. How would my friend that agrees with me with some things on some things politically? How would he respond to me on this issue?
Yeah,
What would he
well,
think?
that can be dangerous if you haven't trained yourself right, because then you could put the straw man in place of the actual person and internalize the straw man, and well, that's
You don't want to internalize the straw man. We don't want to make
that
caricatures of
sounds
one
like
another.
a song. Don't
But it is.
internalize the
But if
straw
you're
man.
looking for advice on how to understand, or say you had to do a debate counter to a position you'd normally hold, you could draw up somebody that
You would have
actually does hold that view that that you respect, even though you disagree with them. And
you'd have to be responsible enough to steel man their end
what
of
would
the
they
argument.
say here? Why do they believe this? And because if you can find where somebody's values originate from, then you can understand how and why that are. You can understand why they're arguing from their perspective and how to argue then from that perspective.
Yep.
Indeed.
Yeah,
So
that's about the end of that. I'll have to.
That's all I had. Yeah, he went
I'll
in
have to-
depth
yeah, I'll
talking
have to
about the
listen back to it.
experiments. But it's interesting that we are finding ways to be able to understand how wisdom operates in the human mind.
Yeah, so the breakdown is basically experiment 1 was testing for wisdom. That seems to be a pretty accurate test. And then experiment 2, which is figuring out which conditions enhance the ability to
and trying to merely
become
enhance
better
the
at test
virtues
1 and 2.
doesn't do it.
One
has to be.
And so through doing these tests, you find out that actually talking to others or internalizing the talking to others does way better than just having more time. So it's more efficient.
Yeah.
At, proving that they're German, of course. Efficiency is their deal. That's the.
But having an ultimate transcendent authority or somebody that you can relate through to the ineffable, the unknowable, by like Jesus Christ or somebody like that. That you can see why that helps people.
Maybe that's what they mean by have a personal.
Here's an
relationship
ultimate
with
example.
Jesus, instead of this idea.
What would Jesus do? You can see why that is a helpful question. Or what would Buddha or Socrates, if you prefer? But Jesus is a great example. It's the best one that humans have come up with yet that we know of. Yeah, I guess we could debate on that, but he's a pretty darn good example.
I mean, there's worse examples out there. But anywho,
he encompasses the hero, the wizard, the saint, the servant, the creative, the architect. He's a carpenter. He's all these different archetypes rolled into one. He's the martyr.
Also the stranger, because he disappeared forever.
Yeah.
And for a long freaking time. And then, what do? You travel the world, and he's just a wandering stranger gathering. I don't think he was just walking around because he was walking around. You go talk to people, you figure out things. He was on a quest. He had a question, and he was on a quest.
He was on a deep inner quest. Yeah. It sounds like he traveled across the desert. Probably did meet some people. Probably sat in some caves for long periods of time.
And we're still unearthing things, that are telling us about our past. And there is proof that there was a guy that was Jesus, and there's proof that he's been in a lot of places through obscure writings and other stuff like that, of some dude coming out of some place that really matched the description of this Jesus guy. But
well, there had to have been somebody like that to inspire these stories of this selfless human being that was a revolution
Yeah.
in, in those cultures and those times, because he was saying that even the poorest people mattered, even the most
Yeah.
forgotten people, the orphans.
Yeah, and it's this idea of sticking up for, or not sticking up for, but really lifting up the lowest without necessarily having to rip down the highest
Mm-hmm.
either, because he was not necessarily, condemning of rich people for being rich. It was more of the behaviors that you did, maybe how you got there, how you treat other people. But it's like, yeah, no, you're all the same in the eyes of God. And the more you hold on to,
And God's love is perfected through
yeah,
all of you,
yeah,
all people.
you are all persons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm gonna go hang up. I'm gonna die for you, so you can forgive yourself because I forgive you. So go ahead and start doing it.
Yeah, right.
Hey, I'm not hanging out here for
So
nothing.
it basically means that no matter how much you've erred in life, you can always start fresh and try to be a better person. Right here, right now, it's never too
Yeah.
late to save yourself and to start being a better person, to be a more loving human being. And I love that even the prince and the king and the emperor is subservient to a higher ideal. Like there's this ultimate ideal of goodness that we all must aspire to, or else society will fall apart. And that's kind of the general gist of the stories.
So,
We'll be in a turmoil of inner and outer hell. We'll make a hell of our own inner lives and our outer worlds, as individuals and as societies.
well, yeah. So you notice that we tend to call our honorifics for, um, like royalty or people in the church. It's like father or sire, which sire is father, or various different languages. We place the highest regard on parenthood, and higher ends of parenthood. You have the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Father is not the Son. The Son is not the Holy Spirit, but God is all of them,
Mm-hmm.
kind of deal. And there's a parental relationship. In the case of God, I think it was in Ezekiel, but
It's a hierarchy of relationship because
but
that
at what point in time?
elder is always more knowledgeable than you are and
Well,
looks over you. And
but that quote I sent you is parents sacrifice their lives for the lives of their children.
mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons why like
The idea
parenthood
of
seems to be
Christ
insanely
sacrificing,
important
that's
to
deep.
us.
There's
Yeah. So and God the Father sacrificing God the Son, witnessed by the Holy Spirit
his
for
life
us, the
serves
children of God.
his life acts as his sacrifice, as his service to us, to be able to have a way to relate with the unknowable infinite nature of something divine like a God, an omnipresent being by which this universe was born. How can a tiny little human relate with that but by an aspect of itself that incarnated into human flesh and then basically lived in sacrifice as a way of being for us, even in the face of ultimate torture, continued to express that way of unconditional love.
Well, ultimately, we do many reflections of that within our family, which family is the most powerful institution on the planet. Somehow there's the core there, but we do this within our own family, like the mother sacrifice, which is you raise the child,
Mm-hmm.
this person, and in order to really make the person a person is to sacrifice them to the freaking world. So that's in the Trinity, what the Father is
For
doing
them
by
to be able
sacrificing the
to
Son.
be able to ever learn to be
Yeah.
independent and self-sufficient.
So these
They
stories,
have to be pushed out at some point. So
yeah.
yeah, I see what you mean.
And
Yeah.
these story the way we come up with these symbols and these story, or we do this to hold on to massive amounts of information and meaning in a simple enough way that can be in some cases just verbally transferred for generations because it's so important.
That's what these
and
old stories
and
do
maybe
for us.
not necessarily the story for itself and what we call the people and who we think they are and this, that, or the other,
Right.
but what was going on there, how does it apply to your life, what insight can you gain from it, and if it's powerful story and and the thing with the Bible is it's a mash of, yes, historical, like, I mean, you can plot it out, you can find the places, you can actually dig things up and find that there, but also this myth around it as well. And a myth is a useful tool,
Teaching
you
tool.
know.
Yeah. The allegory
and to
is
hold on to massive amounts
talking
of
about
information.
concepts that
Yeah.
are so deep that all you can do is use a big metaphor like a story to express the idea out in a way that people can understand and relate to. 'Cause these are lessons that help humans address perennial recurring problems
And you
that
can't,
always return through history to people.
and you can't drift too far from, like, if you want something really powerful like this, you can't drift. So what did we call it in here? It was you gotta be pragmatic with
Oh yeah,
this.
of course.
You got to be able to if you drift too, like, if the myth drifts too far from the actual reality, and so in the case of the Bible, if it drifts too far from history, then it's just a wishy-washy myth that doesn't actually exist.
It's got to
in
keep
real
up
life.
with the times, right?
Same thing with applying things to yourself. If your myth is too far from reality in your daily life, your beliefs, then it's not useful.
Yeah.
It's probably best to evaluate yourself and move on. So, and what is a myth? A tool. But you need to make sure that you use your tools properly. Don't let the screwdriver drive you, right? You drive the screw, not the other way around.
Yeah, because what are we trying to use religion for? Are we using it to try and compete with science about how old the earth is literally? Or are we trying to describe a way of being in the world? Not proclaim our beliefs and use faith as just a mere belief in something that we say that we believe and that makes us
And
the
also,
thing,
you can't.
but that we're involving ourselves in a way of being in the world.
You can't have faith and be certain at the same time, because faith naturally is something you have in uncertainty.
Yeah. We got to remember to think of faith as faithfulness. What it means to have faith is to be faithful to.
Well, also
the way of being that Jesus embodied.
And also on the other end, the idea is like, well, no, you don't know and you can't know. But even within that, I still am I'm holding this.
Yeah, but I am the way, the truth, and
because
the life.
your faith can be broken.
This is the way of being. I'm exhibiting this way of being for you.
Well, that's how faithfulness is how you show.
That's how you show faith.
Because you can't ever be certain.
Faith is the being of it. Faithfulness is that commitment.
Mm-hmm.
It's the process of that commitment.
And what we were talking about in here, is like you can't be certain. What's the term called? I'm looking for the term that we used in here. But basically, it's like you can't be certain, and literally, physically, literally, metaphorically, you cannot be certain about anything. Your heuristics can be very good, and you can be mostly accurate about most things, but you can't be 100% certain about anything. Yeah. Even
so, this check of like re-understanding what rationality actually is that we've gained through this series, it's helping check science and spirituality, because we see this occurring on both sides.
Well, so
it's the problem of ego.
Well, you brought up the certainty of like how old the planet is. It's like, well, science doesn't even really know. We have an educated,
guess.
And I won't say it's a guess.
Pretty exact. It's pretty close, but we don't know.
But we thought that we're actually finding out the universe might be a lot freaking older than it actually is, as far as their measurements go. And science isn't to say this is what it is. It's more of just say, well,
this is as close as we can approximate
we can get until somebody proves me wrong, and we get a little bit closer.
And our measuring devices gain more resolution.
Yeah,
because there seems to be infinite resolution to look into any.
Well, you can look in or look out. That's the.
We keep seeing more. Further we go.
It's funny the farthest. So
we're building another large hadron collider. I heard.
Cool. Well, put it on the other side of the planet and spin them both up at the same time.
Going.
Let's see what happens.
See how small we can go.
Well, what's interesting is, in order to look up and out and see like the farthest galaxies, you're looking at the tiniest speck of degree range. You know, you're not looking at something like this.
Mm-hmm.
That telescope isn't looking at something like this. It's looking at something freaking tiny.
Mm-hmm.
But within that super tiny is so much big stuff. So you're zooming in to zoom out. And then the other end, when you're looking at the smallest stuff, you got to build this like huge thing that
Giant
like
thing.
goes to the maximum of speeds known to man, and then smashes two things together. And then you're only looking at like the residual of something that happened in a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in order to zoom in and make the in big, you still got to go to a tiny itty bitty little window.
Yeah.
So either way, in or out, we're observing the world through tiny little windows.
Right.
And actually usually big
really
things.
high-powered giant instruments.
Yeah. Well, even, you know, like
The further, the bigger.
even the space telescope, you know, that thing is still pretty freaking big. But our satellite telescopes, like we turn the world into a telescope with multiple different locations.
With the radio telescopes.
So a really big thing to look at, something really tiny that has really big things in it.
Yeah.
It's freaking crazy.
It's awesome how it's awesome how we
out
do
in,
that.
out in, out in out at the same time. Oh, there's something
The
in
whole
here for
planet.
that too.
Is doing relevance realization.
Lifespan contextualism. Big picture, little picture, big picture, little picture, big picture, little picture, little picture, big picture in the little picture. Everything's in little pictures, but they're big pictures.
That's big. That's huge.
I know, right? It's weird.
A little big something for you.
Yeah. So, I was going to say this earlier at the beginning about, you know, like we know that there are electrons and they can pass electricity, and, you know, we know that like the electron moves from, you know, an outer shell to an inner shell and does this, but then when you do this, it goes from an inner shell to an outer shell and it does this, but we don't know why. We can always get closer and closer to, you know, okay, well, the electron jumps to the outer shell because we put in this amount of stimulus or whatever, you know, we shot a photon at it, or like added something into it or something, or whatever it is, or heated it up.
Why does
But
that?
we don't know why
Yeah.
heating it up or doing those things makes it do that.
do that? No.
Well, but then we go further and be like, well, because there's so much of, you know, this within the shell, so it has to because of the extra. Okay,
Yeah, but why?
Why is that the case?
Well, why does a higher level of complexity sometimes emerge from two things where that new higher order of complexity could never have been imagined?
What's the prime driver?
How do cells that don't know how to respirate combine in order to become tissues that can respirate?
Well, you know, you like on that level, you could probably, you know, get pretty far down into the weeds of why, but like anything. Okay, so why does water fill the shape of whatever it's in? Why do gases spread out as much as they possibly can in the space?
Because there's like a ton of water in this air right now. If you turned all the H2 and
But like, why would it fill? Why doesn't it just, you know, like stick to one side? Why does it fill equally? Well, okay, you can go even further, but it's like, why do the fundamental facts of reality fact the way they fact? Why do you need a hole to put something in?
why is reality
You know,
tuned this way?
Yeah. You know, you've got a hole. And if you want to put something, you know, in something, you need to have a hole to put it in. Well, why can't you just put something in something without putting a hole in it? Well, if you did that, it would be mixing then. But, you know, why is that? We still...
Why are some parts of space solid?
Yeah, well, we don't know the prime driver of... We can look... We're always looking at the product of something. We're never looking at what's behind it producing.
What is that law of emergence that causes all of that to happen?
Yeah, in that way, specifically under those conditions, and why
do things
But we can still
complexify?
observe it, and we can still use it without understanding.
We can replicate it.
It's,
But we don't understand why there is a law of emergence
we just
that causes it.
reverse engineer it, and that's kind of what, you know, Vervaeke and others have been doing with you know, the psyche, the group psyche, whatever you want to call that, society, with actually how the brain works with all of this stuff. You know, that's what they've been doing. Well, asking the why. How far can we go down into the why? We'll still never get to the complete why, because we're still kind of going, why do we realize what's relevant in the way that we do? And
Right. Well, maybe we can at least try and aim the greatest minds
yeah,
on our planet, that the people that have dedicated their lives to trying to understand human psychology, individual and group psychology, to help and address this meaning crisis, which does seem to be at the fulcrum or at the crux,
yeah.
maybe the locus of the meta crisis. If we can help solve the meaning crisis, we ameliorate the rest of the myriad interacting crises that the species is now facing.
And just because we'll never become perfect and know it all and do that stuff doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
No, it's at least the right direction to lean into,
Yeah.
even if it's a 0.00001% chance of success.
We got to still be careful
Gotta still
about how we
try
get
anyway.
there, because we've learned scientists can be some pretty amoral people. And I don't mean bad morals, I just mean like no morals.
We have to be very careful. We have to be mindful. We have to learn from the lessons of our past
and start practicing the procedures and
the ways to cultivate wisdom.
Practicing and checking back in and practicing and making sure everything's
Yeah.
good with yourself as well as everybody else, and make lines that you will not cross. Like if particularly with dealing with.
Amen to that, man. We got to start doing more of that in our lives. We've lost track of these things, and this is how we can develop our virtues and be virtuous, by attending and holding to those virtues, helping encourage and inspire it in others just through the living of them. And so step by step, we can get somewhere with this. We can, I think, find a way to help revive Christ's way, that Buddha way, in this world again.
Yep.
That's the hope. That is the name of the game. That is the plan, fam. Well, we love you guys. This has been another good one. And apologies for missing you guys the last couple. We have lives and other things going on, and we forewarned everyone getting into the winter, autumn and winter.
Yeah, and it's
things were going to slow down for us.
It's flu and vid season, so
a little bit with the podcast while we got caught up with other life things going on. And
I got sick twice back to back. I was like, when you get like sick for the first time in winter, and you're like, yeah, okay, that's good. I'm gonna be good.
Finally
till
got
spring.
me last week.
Man, I got hit by two different. But hey, such is life. You got to live with the microbes you got, because if you don't got them, well.
Right, yeah, this is true, man. They're part of us.
Well, they are now.
Walking, talking bacteria.
Yeah. Actually, there's
just trying to have a good relationship with all the bacteria.
There's a theory that the reason why humans are the way they are has a lot to do with the viruses we've gotten through our own evolution that, have changed us and also forced us to change. So we actually might have like actual virus DNA that makes up every creature, though, because, if you are alive,
everything is adapting to everything else around it.
Nature does not care.
Nature is
God cares.
Trippy. If you just
but
stop,
nature doesn't care.
Yeah, just stop and look at the world and let it just be new to you. And, like you can do this with a tree or any animal that you see going by. Just take the word tree off of a tree in your mind when you see it, and see that strange organism anew, just as it is, as though you just landed on this alien planet. And there it is. There's this thing, and look at the way it grows and fractals out into the sky, and we know how it fractals out underneath the ground as well. And just imagine what it's doing, how it's like growing towards this thing that we call a sun, this bright, massively huge, giant, burning ball of magma, like pure plasma, just all the time. Always comes back every morning. No matter what we do, it always continues to come back and warm the earth and bring light back.
That'd be a really good
growth
story.
Grow the life.
Have an alien species, like an alien protagonist, that its species grew up in one of the vast, huge voids in our universe that we have. I mean, voids where you'll never see light within these voids because they're so big.
Whoa,
the
so
light
it doesn't know about stars even?
No, because they forgot their history, because, they, went out on whatever colony ships and, warped into this void and things broke down. And we're talking about thousands of years later, just living out in space with the technology, finally rediscovering
Some
it,
dense gases
turning it
around
on
the
and getting,
space they're in. They can't see any
and
stars.
then getting beamed to Earth and seeing, and, having no concept of trees, grass, other critters than what are crittering around on your ship, like,
Whoa.
and then describing, and basically just be the describing nature and everything as somebody who has never experienced any of that would see it, right? And that would be a good practice in writing this story, to get yourself into how would you describe, or how would you experience the world without the word for it, without the context for it. Because a word gives certain context. You say tree, you've got oak tree, maple tree, but the context is tree.
Yeah.
Right.
You can do it too, because you can take away not just the word, but the idea of that kind of placeholder tree that we all have for trees. Like, you're going by hundreds of thousands of trees a day sometimes, it feels like, going down the highway and there's just zooming by. So it's just like tree, tree, tree. But if you really stop and look at any one tree, it's this really complex, sophisticated being. And every single one is original and quite different. And when you look at it just anew, naked eyes, it's this profound thing that you can only experience, and that when you can try and put it into words, or put it, into a poem or a song or something like that. But it's something deeply profound, it's familiar yet alien at once. And
it's the recall before the naming.
And that helps us see with eyes of wonder again, like when we were young, when we were kids, and you see that wonder in a child's eyes all the time. We can always possess that wonder and that natural affinity for life, that real openness, taking in all the information, because we tend to boil things down into like kind of low resolution placeholders. There's my low resolution idea of a tree, to watch out for that while I'm driving. But you can actually still do everything you need to do and see the world fully, without those placeholders, those little icons that we put in place. We do it for people, we do it for objects.
It's interesting. Smells, right? And we love smells as humans. You can smell something and it can flood you with the exact feeling of an entire memory without going through the timeline of the memory and the word.
It's our strongest sense, yet our sense of smell is so weak compared to dogs and cats.
And our brain dedicates quite the amount of brain power to the sense of smell. And, that makes sense, because
they bring us those memories back, that sense of place.
Before the eyeball or the ear, there was the chemical receptor. It, like, the amoebas, they have,
that makes sense,
basic chemical receptors around them, so they can, basically hot, cold tell where things are. And then it just
so
gets
it's the most developed.
Yeah, our sense of smell is definitely the longest developing thing. Except for our touch.
So smell and taste go in tandem.
Direct touch is definitely probably like the oldest as far as species go, because it's just things bumping around, and then when it gets touched, mechanical action happens.
Response,
that doesn't go much further than whatever. But and also touch, like touch is one of our most sensitive. Well, our brain.
That's the point of having emotions.
Well, have you seen the homunculus of the brain? So it shows a man and how much space our brain uses according to what it is. Yeah. Touch just in itself, how much you have for your hands and your mouth. And you know why babies put things in their mouth? Because there's way more neurons in there, and they can touch. And they can figure things out and then use their chemical receptors. I guarantee everyone here, what a boot or a shoe or a flip-flop tastes like.
Whoa.
You know why? And you're like, I can't remember ever putting a boot in my mouth. But as a baby, at one point in time, there was a shoe or a flip-flop or a boot that went in your mouth and logged.
When you said flip-flop, I got a taste that reminds me of like rubber, the rubber eraser on a pencil.
Yeah.
I remember I must have eaten some, at least bitten to one flop in my time.
Yeah. Oh, well,
it happened.
And you don't have the memory of doing it logged in your head, but do you have? It's just weird. And
you can imagine the sensation of the smell. At least you can get pretty damn close.
Yeah, You know, like if I say leather, you know what leather tastes like? Pennies. You know what pennies taste like? It's funny, like how many things you can go through that you're like, I'd never put that in my mouth. You know what a public restroom doorknob tastes like?
Ew.
Well,
Don't go there.
at one point in time, you've put something similar enough to that in your mouth, and then you have enough associated memories from public bathrooms to put the two
I
and
can't
two.
get that one. That makes me feel pretty good about myself. I didn't lick any public bathroom doorknobs as a kid.
If you think about it, though, you could put together actually a good profile of what that thing would taste like.
If I wanted to think about it, yeah, but I think my brain did a good job putting up a mental block and being like, nope.
And not everybody's as super sensitive. I'm super sensitive to smell and taste and stuff like that. It's just, I don't know.
Dude, I lost so much of
Oh,
my
man.
smell from COVID. When I had COVID a couple years back, it's still slowly rebuilding itself to this day.
Yeah. Well, at least you remember what.
Since the smell is remapping
At
itself.
least you remember what a flip flop tastes like. Once you get it all back, you should taste a flip flop and make sure.
I can
it's still
imagine
good.
almost the idea of the sensation of the smell, but I can't quite.
Yeah, it's not.
But something like eraser on a pencil, I think it's close to it.
Yeah.
Some kind of weird rubber.
Yeah, the human brain, it just works so funny.
It's a funky thing.
Yeah. The fact that we can describe what something tastes like to somebody and have them eat it and not be completely surprised about what it tastes like is phenomenal. It's awesome. You know, it's like, well, it has a sweet, musky aroma to it with a, you know, a sharp tang of maybe like lemon or, still referential.
Yeah, but you
we
can notice
still-
like the notes of chocolate in your coffee or wine or whatever.
Yeah, right.
know, all that.
No, with wine, you know, they've got stuff like saddle leather is one of the flavors of, you know, like when you taste wine and all that stuff. Mushroom, cork,
Oh,
you
yeah,
know,
oak,
like a
yeah.
bunch of random flavors and stuff like, you know. And then we have words to describe, you know, even further. Astringent, you know what that tastes like. You know, just even by the sound of the name, astringent.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
tastes like something that's good for you, but you don't like, you know, that you probably rub onto yourself.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, that's
like something
medicinal.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Actually, that's one of the words to synonyms for astringent is
Medicinal.
yeah.
Yeah. Isn't that weird also how we can say words in different ways and then it's like medicinal, medicinal.
Or if there's not a real, oh yeah, right. Medicinal. Put the emphasis on the wrong syllable.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Emphasis. Yeah, emphasis. Yeah.
And the fact that us primate, you know, just being advanced primates as we are, but primates that can just have fun. Not just
whole
with sounds, but
making mouth sounds to communicate thing is pretty wild. And how fast we can get skilled at any different kind of task. You know, we went through a lot in our primate evolution, but it's hard to account for some of the strange skill sets that we come up with. Like, you know, speed chess or
hyper specialization.
hyper specialization gets pretty far out there.
I think it's our
wild.
communal nature and taking care of each other that allows that to happen because hyper specialized species tend to die. So a hyper specialized person without other people that are more generalized will tend to die.
Interesting.
Like if you can't see very far but you can see up close and you're really good at making tools.
Yeah.
If you're by yourself, you're more likely to get eaten by something because you can't see it and you're not very strong. But if you're with others, you can make them better and they can fill. And that's where it's like we need people. That's another thing. Being communal creatures is deeply, deeply ingrained, much like our senses. You know, our smell. Like, because
we're not just intelligent alone.
Yeah,
we're intelligent as a species together.
It turns out,
and every part of our intelligence is building off of things that we've learned from others and gained from others, or it's part of our biology already. Everything from our language and our ideas to how we think and approach things is something that we're learning from all that came before us. And we're putting our own unique spin on it and adding to that story.
Yeah, a sad thought came to mind. Like there are quite a few people that don't have the ability to inner monologue, like talk in their head. So that removes one of the, I won't say shortcuts, but efficiency providers that, like, being able to talk in your head and do that.
That can also be something that can be quite a
But we have groups of
restriction
people.
because you can get addicted to identifying with the thought
I would
in the
like to
head.
see an experiment to. It's not a theory, it's barely a hypothesis, but maybe measure, like, you have, what do you call it? Not social, antisocial, but extrovert and introvert, right? Like people who prefer the company of people. I'd like to see if those without inner monologue people tend to be more extroverted and around people and talking
I would
and
think so, man.
bouncing things
Yeah.
off
Yeah.
more than say like introverted people, like, and measure like how
Yeah.
powerful of an inner monologue do they have and see where they go in as far as being
That
extrovert
would
or
be
introvert. That'd be, well, first you have to figure out how to test for the power of the inner monologue, and that's a problem I haven't even given any thought to. Like,
how you would scale that.
yeah, how would
break
you
that
measure
down
it? How
and
would you put a
measure it for
ruler to
people?
it and do it accurately? There's probably some tests that are already made that
It's going to be pretty general.
do that, but yeah,
You can get some idea from it, but it's not going to be.
You could-
I mean,
you could just probably ask.
it's going to be
if you ask enough people, like,
everyone's
hey,
answers are going to be subjective. So how you define the scaling is going to be very important.
and
It's going to be hard to get very super specific with it, no matter
yeah,
what you do.
What questions do you ask the people? Because like,
Yeah, because it's hard to say
ultimately-
how many thoughts do you have a minute or every 10 seconds. You're basically asking questions like, how busy does your mind feel? How much are you talking to yourself in your mind?
Or you
A
could,
lot. Sometimes, it's going to be very general.
or you could ask them, like, like if you were talking to your dad about something more in depth than just like if you did something stupid or something like that, but something in depth, what would he say? I wonder if that would be a good test for like inner monologue, because you kind of have to go through that and go, well, instead of he would be pissed, it's like, no, what would he say? And you could probably gauge
How developed
at least
somebody is, at least
yeah, like how developed their inner monologue,
able
I
to-
guess. Because if you somebody with a really good inner monologue would be like, well, I told you not to do it, and you did it. How'd you feel about it? Hmm? And would like mimic them completely and have their mannerisms down,
Right.
because you run that through your head. The
Yeah,
people have that.
yeah.
The people who do the best impersonations are the ones who can internalize the sound in their head and then figure out how to.
Their mirror neurons are firing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes
Alright.
sense.
Yeah, that just interesting experiment. Hey, if any of you guys are scientifically minded and you have that government research money, and you want to like do whatever you got to do to like prove that you're worth your salt to get your degree, and that's one of the things you can do. Hey, go for it.
That would be a fun experiment.
Testing the inner monologue to social persuasion matrix. See if there's a correlation between the two.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like it.
Because that would solve a problem of like if people don't have inner monologues, how do they deal with their problems? And if you have an isolated person that doesn't really have an inner monologuing capability, you need to figure out how to get them around other people if they want to better themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And see if it's possible for them to develop an inner monologue, and if not, then they definitely need to be socializing
Or probably
with people with that shared goal mentality.
I think reading would probably help too, because then they're able to.
Writing, journaling can help a lot for everybody. Yeah, we need to be able to put our ideas out there to be able to think them through and understand them.
Yeah, well, particularly to remember them over time, which it's what literacy is good for. Being able to do that over time.
This is the truth.
So everybody should strive to be as literate as they can and try to help other people be as literate as they can.
Seems like a valid goal.
Yeah, and not Fierian literacy, because that guy was a commie kook, but which is social political literacy, not knowing how to read and reason your thoughts and put together sentence structures that can convey things to other people. So you got to know what you need to do. To be,
Rabbit holes to avoid.
it's a good rabbit hole to go down if you want to understand what's going on in our schooling system. But
that though, truth.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, don't go down the rabbit hole just automatically. Believe in everything you read. You're looking at it to understand it with a critical eye.
Yeah.
Well, this has been awesome, my man. Thank you, fam, for joining us.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure to smash the like and subscribe if you guys are enjoying, and share the love with John Vervaeke as well. And look for us next time studying the theories of wisdom in episode 44. Next week, we'll be getting together. We're going to be pushing for 6 p.m. We're going to continue to test out starting times here, but probably end up settling around 6.
Like 6, and then be done by 8:30.
Yeah, 7 today because we were running a little bit late and we had to get things together. But look for us 6 next week, or just catch us on the flip side after the live stream anytime here on YouTube, and always on Spotify and Stitcher and Apple and Google Podcasts and all those places. Thank you guys for joining us. Make sure to rate this podcast and help us reach more people by commenting and sharing with your friends and family. And happy holidays.
Happy
all y'all.
holidays.
It's that time of year. Be safe out there. Stay bright.
Peace.
See you guys next time.